A predator bit into her leg when she was only 3 years old, and she didn't cry. This is the story of Shaak Ti, the silent edge of the council. She was born in the shadows of tall trees, where the air stayed wet and the ground was never still. Her world was Shili, a jungle world filled with color but not safety. Life there was about movement, about hearing before being heard, and about killing before being killed. The Togruta, her people, didn't teach this. They lived it. Every hour, every season, every generation. They moved in packs, hunted with silence, and survived with instinct older than language. The weak vanished, the cautious lived. That was their way. Shaak Ti never knew her parents. No stories about them survived the storm seasons. Her first memories weren't of lullabies or warmth. They were of tall grasses brushing against her face as she crawled, hidden from something watching nearby, of small fires, quickly snuffed, of eyes, yellow, red, hungry, waiting just beyond the tree line. She was a quiet child, not because she was shy, but because she understood early that noise meant death. At night her people told stories around low embers, stories of those who went too far into the brush, of younglings taken by beasts with no names, of spirits in the sky who judged from above. Some called those spirits gods, others called them watchers. Shaak Ti didn't know which they were, but she looked up often, staring through the cracks in the jungle canopy, wondering if anyone above saw her. One night, a ship came down through the clouds. Not loud, not the kind that hunted. This one hummed like wind over still water, and inside it were the ones who had watched from the stars, Jedi. They didn't arrive with guns or demands, just quiet eyes and calm voices. They spoke to the elders, offered peace, promised protection, and asked only for one thing in return. Shaak Ti. She didn't know what the word Force-sensitive meant, but she felt the fear behind her clan's silence. Some didn't want her to go, others were too afraid to argue. When she was led to the ship, she didn't struggle, she didn't cry, but she looked back only once, not at her people, but at the tree line, at the place where something had once tried to eat her and failed. In that glance was something that stayed with her, a promise she never spoke aloud. I survived this place, and I remember how. The stars were quiet as the ship rose. Shaak Ti sat alone, not speaking. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask what the Jedi wanted. She already knew. They wanted her strength, but they didn't understand its shape, not yet. And far below, Shili kept breathing, watching, waiting. It had raised her with fangs and silence, and though she would never set foot on it again, it never truly let her go. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was not like the jungle. There were no predators hiding behind leaves, no sudden storms, no blood in the soil, but it was not peaceful, not for her. Shaak Ti was still a child when she was brought to the temple, but already something inside her was older than most who walked its halls. Other younglings cried at night. She didn't. Others asked questions. She stayed silent. It wasn't discipline, it was memory. Her new world was made of stone and ceremony. The masters spoke softly, moved deliberately, and taught rules that expected a calm heart and a still mind. But Shaak Ti didn't trust stillness. She had learned that movement meant life. So she listened, she obeyed, but inside she stayed ready. The temple's teachings were clear. Let go of fear, let go of anger, let go of attachment. But to Shaak Ti, fear had been a teacher, anger had been fuel, and attachment was the reason she was still alive. She never broke the rules, but she didn't forget the truths she had learned before the Jedi gave her new ones. Some masters saw her silence as discipline, others worried it hid defiance. None could prove either. One day she was asked what she remembered of Shili, of her clan, of the night she left. She answered with only 3 words, "I watched everything." The master nodded, not understanding what those words truly meant. Shaak Ti excelled in training. Her movements were precise, her mind controlled. But when her saber met another in sparring, there was always a flash, too fast, too sharp, that caught the others off guard. A strike not taught, not explained. Something from before, something primal. One instructor whispered that her instincts were too fast, too wild. Another said it was simply the mark of someone who would be great. She advanced quickly, faster than most, but she made no friendships along the way. Connection was hard. The other Padawans spoke of childhoods filled with dreams, stories, or hope. Shaak Ti didn't remember dreams, only survival. She didn't laugh when they laughed, didn't cry when they cried. She observed, she absorbed. And sometimes, late at night, she wandered the temple's upper levels, alone, quiet, staring out into the city below. The lights of Coruscant stretched endlessly. Ships blinked like fireflies in the mist, but she always looked higher, past the buildings, into the stars. She wasn't looking for anything, she was remembering them. The stars were the last thing she saw before the Jedi took her from her home. The last thing she shared with the land that made her. In them she felt something watching, not the Force, something more personal. A gaze she couldn't name. Some nights, she wondered if Shili looked back. As her training continued, the Jedi gave her more trust. Missions, tests, leadership, but they never saw the whole of her, because she never showed it, not out of rebellion, out of protection. She had learned young that showing too much got you noticed, and when you were noticed, something usually came for you. So she gave them what they needed: progress, precision, obedience. But inside she kept her oldest truth hidden. In a world built by calm, she had been born in chaos. And one day, the galaxy would return to that chaos. When it did, she wouldn't need to prepare. She had never truly left it. By the time she was chosen as a Padawan, Shaak Ti had become someone the temple respected but did not understand. She was assigned to a Jedi Knight named Jora Mali, a scholar, not a warrior. He taught her philosophy, encouraged reflection, and spoke endlessly about how knowledge could prevent war. Shaak Ti listened. She said little, and in time her master began to believe she agreed. But while Jora spoke of peace, she remembered movement. She remembered how quiet her clan had been before a predator struck, how soundless the jungle grew just before something died. She knew what silence really meant. Their missions together were uneventful at first: peacekeeping, negotiation, diplomacy. Jora believed these would shape her. He didn't see that they only taught her how fragile the galaxy truly was. Everywhere they went, she saw conflict waiting to break loose. The Force whispered unrest in places where people smiled too wide and bowed too low. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge him. But when trouble finally came, she acted without waiting. On the planet Aloria, a trade dispute turned violent. Hostages were taken. Jora began diplomatic measures, hoping words could buy time. Shaak Ti slipped away without orders. She found the captives, disabled their guards, and brought them out before negotiations had even begun. Jora was furious. He told her that Jedi must obey the will of the Council, follow protocol, respect the process. She said nothing. Because she knew something he didn't. The captors were seconds away from killing the hostages, and she had seen that truth long before it became visible. After that, Jora filed for her reassignment. He said she had learned all she could from him, and perhaps more than she should have. Her next instructor was less concerned with thought and more with action, and that finally gave her space to move the way she was built to. When she faced other Padawans in training duels, her strikes were precise, not flashy. Her footwork was unreadable. Her defense looked minimal, until her opponents realized they couldn't find a way in. She wasn't the fastest, strongest, or most technical, but she was something worse: unpredictable. She didn't fight like the others because she had never learned safety first. She had learned to survive. not by defeating, but by not dying. Her blade followed instinct, not form. Eventually her trials came. She passed them. The council granted her the rank of knight. They praised her control, her patience, her insight. But they had never seen her in the dark. They had never seen her pressed to the edge, where fear smelled like soil and blood, where she could hear breath through leaves. They had never seen who she truly was, because she never showed them. When she was sent into the galaxy alone, for the first time, she didn't feel nervous. She didn't feel proud. She felt ready. Not because she believed in the Jedi, but because the jungle had raised her for something harder. The temple had tried to make her forget, make her calm, make her pure. But her strength had never come from those things. It came from what the Jedi tried to remove. And though she wore their robes, spoke their words, and followed their rules, she remembered who she was before they took her, and what she might need to become again. Her first years as a Jedi Knight passed without ceremony. No grand victories, no scandals, no failures. She moved from one mission to the next like a shadow, visible only when necessary, forgotten when not. But that was how she preferred it. The galaxy was changing, whispers of separatism, systems growing restless, small wars flaring on forgotten borders. The Jedi still believed diplomacy could hold the seams together. But Shaak Ti had walked through too many quiet cities, had looked into too many eyes pretending not to be afraid. The peace was cracking. She could feel it in the Force and in her bones. The Jedi Council began to notice her, not for charm, not for presence, but for results. Her missions ended quickly, often without bloodshed, but with decisions that unsettled those who reviewed them later. She always followed the code. Technically, but she made choices others hesitated to make. And each time, she wrote nothing more than what was required in her reports. Eventually, they summoned her. She was brought before the council not to be questioned, but to be offered a seat. It wasn't common. She was young, by Jedi standards. Not political, not loud, but she was steady, and in a galaxy leaning toward chaos, steadiness was becoming rare. She accepted. Her seat in the council chamber was near the outer curve, close to the long windows that overlooked the endless city. From there she could see the lights stretch into the mist, and beyond them, if she stared long enough, she could almost remember the stars. She did not speak often in council meetings, but when she did, she chose her words carefully. She warned of impatience, of pride, of ignoring silence because it was uncomfortable. Few listened, not because they didn't respect her, but because her voice did not rise to meet theirs. She didn't argue, she observed. And in those observations, she saw the truth. The Jedi had become predictable. Their movements followed logic, their strategies followed hope. Their trust in peace was not matched by readiness for war. But Shaak Ti had never trusted peace, not entirely. The jungle had taught her that silence was a lie, that stillness meant something was watching, waiting. She trained herself harder than she was asked to, woke before others, meditated in colder chambers, fought against droids set just a little too fast. Her strength didn't come from fear. It came from knowing what fear really was. And when the Clone Wars began, she didn't flinch. She didn't celebrate either. She understood what it meant. She was sent to Kamino to oversee the production of clones. Tens of thousands of identical faces, all bred for one thing: war. The Jedi thought they would guide the clones, teach them restraint, lead them with compassion. Shaak Ti didn't lie to herself. She knew what the galaxy had decided. The war was already here, and her job was no longer to prevent it. Her job was to survive it, and to keep others from forgetting what that cost. She stood on observation decks while children trained with live fire. She watched them age in months what others did in years. She taught them tactics, discipline, morality. But she never told them it would be enough, because she knew it wouldn't be. And somewhere in her mind, even as she tried to help them, she remembered that jungle, the place that taught her the truth no code could erase. Instinct is not weakness. Instinct is what keeps you alive. Even when the people you trust forget how to see danger coming. The day she was offered a seat on the Jedi High Council, she said nothing for several seconds, just a quiet nod, a bow, then silence. There was no celebration, no ceremony, no pride, only another duty. Another position from which she would continue watching the galaxy unravel, one thread at a time. Shaak Ti never asked for power, and the Council didn't offer it as a reward. They chose her because she was steady, not loud, not political, not ambitious, but because she listened. And in a room full of voices, that made her rare. She took her place on the curved circle of chairs, high above the city. The chamber's walls glowed faint blue from the Coruscant sky beyond. She watched the ships trace silent lines across the haze, and when others spoke, she remained still, hands folded, eyes focused, words measured. She didn't interrupt, she didn't challenge, she waited until the right moment, and when she did speak, it was with a voice that didn't chase attention, just truth. Not everyone liked that. Mace Windu respected her discipline. Ki-Adi-Mundi saw her as overly cautious. Yoda saw something else, a presence that reminded him of the Force in its most natural form, quiet, unshaped, observing. But even he didn't always listen when she spoke. The war had begun, and the Council was changing. Meetings grew tenser, patience shorter, trust thinner. Some masters argued for more control, some wanted secrecy, some thought they could guide the Republic by stepping closer to it. Shaak Ti didn't believe in proximity, she believed in clarity, and from her seat she could see what others refused to admit. The Jedi were becoming tools, not guides, instruments of someone else's design. But she never said it out loud, because by then no one truly wanted to hear it. She wasn't the kind of leader who used fear to move people. She didn't make bold speeches. She didn't predict doom. She simply noticed when the room got quieter after certain decisions were made. She paid attention when Anakin Skywalker entered chambers late, eyes storming with things he never said. When Obi-Wan carried fresh wounds from a campaign he wasn't supposed to survive. When Yoda paused too long between sentences. The war wasn't just outside, it was inside them now. Shaak Ti still fulfilled her duties. She still sat on the council, still trained, still advised. But more and more she found herself pulled back, not by choice, but by the speed at which everything was collapsing. The Jedi were no longer meditating on balance. They were debating tactics, coordinating battalions, planning strikes, arguing about clone supply lines. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the Force had grown quiet. Not gone, just muffled. As if the galaxy had stopped listening, or maybe the Jedi had stopped listening first. Shaak Ti did not try to shout over the storm. She had never been built for that. Instead, she watched for small shifts, faint tremors, the kind of warning you only catch if you're silent long enough. And she felt something coming. Not just defeat, not just betrayal. Something worse. Something the Council wouldn't hear until it was far too late. She never got used to the emptiness between Council meetings. The chamber was always clean, quiet, echoing, but the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt hollow, like the room remembered voices that had already faded. Some chairs had been filled for decades, others now rotated too quickly. War left little room for consistency. Masters were called away, killed, replaced, and Shaak Ti remained. She was often alone there, long after meetings ended, watching the city lights shift from orange to blue to black again, listening to a room built for 12 become a tomb of unspoken thoughts. She sat where the voices once rose. Now those voices whispered less or not at all. It wasn't just the Council that had changed. The temple itself was quieter, not in sound but in feeling. The younglings still trained, the instructors still walked the halls, but there was something missing, something she used to feel through the walls, through the floor, through the force itself. Hope. The temple had once hummed with it. It had filled the air like warmth. Now everything felt colder, distant. She didn't speak of it. She didn't need to. She saw it in the way other masters avoided each other's eyes, in how some stayed in their quarters longer, how laughter became rare, how meditation sessions stretched longer than they used to, as if everyone was trying to find something that had already slipped through their fingers. Shaak Ti wasn't sure when the council became something she didn't recognize. It didn't happen all at once. It came in small changes, in rushed decisions, in voices raised for urgency, in votes that passed before questions had even been asked. She didn't resist them. That wasn't her way. She simply sat, the same way she had sat on the jungle floor as a child, hidden from a predator that hadn't yet struck, waiting for someone to notice. But the galaxy didn't notice quiet people. And the council, they were no longer listening for quiet warnings. When Chancellor Palpatine began asking more of the Jedi, Shaak Ti saw no surprise in the other's eyes, just tired agreement. He asked for surveillance powers, for military authority, for direct command. And the Jedi gave it to him. Some hesitated, most didn't set. Shaak Ti said little, but she remembered his voice, the way it curled at the edge of reason, the way his gaze lingered too long. There was no anger in her, no suspicion, only stillness, the kind that came just before a jungle went dark. She trained herself to remember those moments, not to act but to prepare. She began spending more time in the archives, not for research, but for clarity. She read the oldest records, not the victories, the failures, the fall of the Jedi before the Republic, the mistakes that had ended orders stronger than theirs, the betrayals that were never seen until they were too close. Patterns. Every extinction began with silence. And the silence was louder now than it had ever been. She didn't tell anyone what she feared. Fear was not allowed. Not among the council, not even within herself. But she knew what was happening. Slowly, piece by piece, the Jedi were becoming something they were never meant to be. And she was still watching, still waiting, still listening in the room where ghosts now sat beside her. When she spoke in council meetings, she chose her words carefully, not to avoid conflict, but because she knew most of them wouldn't be heard anyway. There was always a louder voice. Mace Windu's certainty, Ki-Adi-Mundi's logic, even Yoda, for all his age and caution, had begun speaking more with authority than wonder. Shaak Ti didn't fight them. She wasn't there to win arguments, but she still told the truth. She warned that the clones were not soldiers, they were children growing under pressure, that their minds were obedient, not because they were disciplined, but because they were engineered. She said that war wasn't sharpening the Jedi, it was grinding them down. She asked once if anyone remembered what peace had felt like. No one answered. They moved on to the next topic. War made every meeting faster, everything urgent, every hour filled, every decision reactive. There was no time to reflect, no time to pause. So she paused alone. Shaak Ti spent more and more of her time between missions in solitude, walking the temple halls that still held the scent of old stone and rain, even though it hadn't rained on Coruscant in centuries. She would pass Padawans being rushed through new lessons, trials that once took years now crammed into weeks, teachers who were once gentle now strained with exhaustion. The Jedi were being reshaped, quietly, and not from outside, from within. Shaak Ti had never been sentimental. She didn't cling to tradition for the sake of it, but she felt something sacred unraveling. The Jedi Code still lived in their words, but not in their hearts. They spoke of calm while planning strikes. They preached detachment while burying friends in war zones. They claimed balance, even as the Republic gave them more power than they had ever asked for. She saw it all, and still said very little. She believed in timing, that the right word at the right moment could shift the course of a room, but those moments were growing rare. So she preserved her words like water in a dry season. When Anakin Skywalker was given a seat on the council, she didn't raise her voice. She watched as his presence tilted the room, not because he asked for too much, but because no one around him truly knew what he needed. Shaak Ti had seen his fear long before others had, not the fear of death, but the fear of losing control, of being powerless. The same fear the council had, they just wore it better. She tried once to speak to him, not as a master, not as a superior, just as someone who had survived by learning to stay quiet. She asked him how he slept. He didn't answer, just looked past her to a place she couldn't follow. That was the last time they spoke. Shaak Ti wasn't blind. She saw the cracks forming in everything they'd built, the way Palpatine looked at Anakin, the way the Senate clapped louder for war than they ever had for peace, the way the council kept telling themselves they were doing what was necessary, even when that necessity began to feel like surrender. She recorded her concerns, logged them, never emotional, never defiant, just documented. And each time she wondered if anyone even read them. Wisdom doesn't echo in a room already filled with noise. And Shaak Ti had spent most of her life trying to be heard by people who only valued sound when it matched their own. So she stopped trying and started preparing for what would happen when no one was left to listen. She could still remember the first time she walked through the clone training fields on Kamino. Rows of identical boys, heads shaved, eyes empty, blaster fire echoing in the artificial storm outside. Every movement timed, every breath measured, perfection without joy, precision without thought. And she sensed being told this was a victory. Shaak Ti didn't argue. Not then. She was a Jedi Master, a council member, a leader, but deep inside she was still the child who had once hidden in the grass, waiting for danger to pass. And she knew what it looked like when something powerful was being trained not to feel. She tried to reach them, not as warriors, but as people, spoke to them, walked among them, watched them sleep, eat, train. She learned their numbers, some of their names. She tried to give them something the Kaminoans never designed into them, purpose beyond orders. But the war didn't just leave room for that. The galaxy had become a machine. The Jedi were gears, the clones were fuel. And when she returned to Coruscant, she carried that with her. Meetings blurred, missions stacked. Jedi were dying in numbers not seen in centuries. And the Council, once the heart of balance, had become the command center of a failing war. Shaak Ti tried to keep up, but every decision felt heavier, every vote more desperate. They spoke less about the Force and more about movements, about supply lines, about strategy. Peace became a theory, something to be hoped for, not planned for. And still, she remained. Because she knew someone had to remember what they used to be. She started writing more. Not reports, not orders, just thoughts, personal records. She stored them deep in the temple archives. No one knew, no one checked. She wasn't set leaving them for the Council. She was leaving them for the Jedi who might survive what came next. Because something was coming. She could feel it in every quiet moment between battle updates, in the way Anakin paced, in how Mace had stopped joking, even in private, in how even Yoda had begun spending more time alone. The war had changed all of them, and not in the way they admitted. Shaak Ti began spending more time in the medical wing, not because she was injured, but because the silence there felt more honest. Pain was clearer than politics. Suffering didn't hide behind protocol. She sat beside wounded clones, some who would recover, some who wouldn't. She held their hands. She didn't always know what to say. But they didn't need words. They just needed someone to sit with them without looking away. In those moments, she didn't feel like a master. She felt like someone remembering what it meant to care before command made it complicated. And as the days passed, she found herself spending less time in the council chamber, not out of protest, but because the silence there had become unbearable. It no longer spoke of peace. It echoed with decisions no one wanted to take credit for, with hopes that no longer had shape, with a storm growing so close they couldn't hear it anymore. Shaak Ti still showed up, still voted, still served. But inside, she had already started saying goodbye. Not to the Order, to what the Order had been. Because the Jedi were mist falling. They were being drowned. And when the sound of war finally faded, she wondered if there would be anyone left who even remembered what silence was supposed to feel like. The sound of rain never stopped. Not once, not in the morning, not in the middle of the night. On Kamino, the sky never opened. It only pressed down, heavy, endless, gray. Shaak Ti stood in silence the first time she saw it from the landing platform. The rain wasn't violent. It didn't crash. It whispered steady and cold, like it had always been there and would always remain. It was fitting. Kamino was not a place for warmth, not a place for light. It was a place of function, precision, without affection. She had been sent there to oversee production. The council trusted her, not because she asked for the assignment, but because she would follow the Order's guidance without letting emotion interfere. They were wrong. Not about her discipline, but about the absence of emotion. Shaak Ti didn't fear feelings. She feared what happened when people pretended they didn't exist. And that was all. Kamino was a planet where feelings had been erased from the surface of life. Inside the white halls of Tipoca City, the Kaminoans moved like echoes, tall, pale, detached. They didn't smile, they didn't frown. They observed, they measured, they calculated. And they created soldiers, tens of thousands, born in vats, grown in chambers, programmed for loyalty, accelerated through childhood, identical but not the same. Shaak Ti had seen cloning in reports before, read the science, understood the justification, but standing in that facility, watching children march in unison, answer to numbers, and fire weapons before their voices had settled, she felt something twist inside her. This wasn't set training, it was shaping. The Kaminoans called them property, units, assets. Shaak Ti knew better. She didn't show her discomfort, not openly. Jedi were not meant to question the decisions of the Council, and the clones were a necessity, a military solution to a war that had come too quickly, too completely. Still, she watched them. She walked past the sleeping chambers, where rows of boys dreamed beneath sterile lights. She observed the simulators, where 10-year-olds made choices no child should face. She read their files, not for strategy, but for names, real names, not CT numbers, names the clones had given themselves. Fives, Echo, Dogma, Tup, Rex. Shaak Ti didn't interfere with the training. That wasn't her role, but when she spoke to them, she used those names. It didn't go unnoticed. Neither by the Kaminoans nor the clones. One asked her why a Jedi Master would treat them like individuals when even their instructors didn't. She had no answer that would have satisfied a clone bred to obey, so she simply said, "Because you are." It wasn't set a statement of rebellion, just truth, but truth on Kamino always felt like something dangerous. Shaak Ti began to spend longer hours in the observation towers, alone, overlooking the storm, watching drills, watching decisions being made, not by Jedi, but by scientists, watching children become soldiers while the Republic looked away. She recorded her reports, filed them with the Council. She wrote nothing emotional, nothing accusatory. But she began keeping a separate record, a private log, not just of clone performance, but of their stories, the ones who hesitated before firing, the ones who smiled when they thought no one was watching, the ones who asked questions they weren't supposed to ask. She wasn't at cataloging errors. She was remembering humanity, because she knew what this war would do to them. And someday someone had to remember who these clones were before they were used for what they'd been made to do. She watched them grow. Not over years, but months. The Kaminoans had perfected the speed of it. Childhood reduced to something programmable. The clones went from toddler to teenager before they had time to ask who they were. Every stage of their life was mapped, scheduled, refined. They were not taught to play, not taught to wonder, only to obey. Shaak Ti walked the halls daily. She made herself available, but even her presence became part of the routine. Another variable accounted for. Most clones didn't look her in the eyes, not because of fear, but because it had never been taught. They stood straight when she passed, saluted, replied with precision. But she wasn't set looking for precision. She was looking for cracks. And over time, she found them. One cadet, no older than 9, asked her why Jedi carried lightsabers if they preached peace. Another said he had dreams that didn't match the simulations. No gunfire, no commands, just fields, blue sky, things he didn't have names for. A third broke formation to help a fallen brother, only to be punished for it. The Kaminoans were not cruel, but they were distant. Efficiency was not cruelty to them, it was necessity. They believed the clones were functioning as intended. Shaak Ti didn't argue, but every time she walked past a child being told he wasn't fast enough, sharp enough, silent enough, she felt a pulse. The Jedi weren't built for this. The code had never prepared them for this kind of leadership, not over armies, and certainly not over lives that were made to die. She reported her findings. She mentioned stress fractures, signs of moral hesitation. She warned that these were children, not droids, and they would need more than orders to survive the war ahead. But the response from Coruscant was always the same: proceed with efficiency. The war was expanding. Jedi were dying. The clones were the only reason the Republic still held the line. So her warnings became background noise. Even among the Council, some believed attachment to the clones would cloud judgment, that Shaak Ti's time on Kamino was pulling her too close. She didn't disagree, but she didn't apologize either. She had seen too much to pretend this was just another assignment. Some days she stood at the edge of the cloning tanks, endless rows of developing bodies suspended in fluid, faces not yet awake, limbs still forming, each one identical, each one waiting to be told who they were. She would press her hand to the glass and wonder how many would live long enough to know what choice even meant. She didn't say these things aloud, not to the Jedi, not to the Kaminoans, only to herself and to the Force. She meditated often, not to clear her mind, but to hold it together. In the quiet, she tried to send something into the ether, not commands, not plans, just a whisper that maybe these lives were more than tools, that maybe someone, somewhere, would see them as more than numbers. She didn't expect the Force to answer, but she hoped maybe it would listen, because the clones did listen, more than anyone realized, and one day she feared they would remember everything, even the silence of the Jedi who were supposed to protect them. Some of them began to look her in the eyes. Not often, not all at once, but gradually in the mess halls, the corridors, the training yards. They would pause, sometimes just for a moment, and meet her gaze, as if asking whether she saw them, whether she understood. She did. And though she couldn't say it out loud, she knew they were changing. The Kaminoans didn't notice. Their reports still listed the clones as compliant, effective, unwavering. But Shaak Ti saw the signs that no metric could measure. Small hesitations, quiet glances between brothers, questions asked in coded language. They were learning to think beyond the war. Some started using their nicknames more openly. Others modified their armor, even if regulations forbade it. One painted a red stripe across his helmet. Another etched marks into his vambrace after every mission, not for kills, but for those he had saved. These weren't set malfunctions. They were memories forming. Shaak Ti didn't interfere. She simply stayed close. When she passed them during drills, they stood straighter, not out of fear, but recognition. They knew she was different. She wasn't watching for mistakes. She was watching for the pieces of themselves that the system tried to remove. One evening, a clone named Hawk asked her a question she never expected. "Do you think we will still be here when it sets over?" She didn't answer, because she didn't know what over meant anymore. The war was growing, the death toll climbing. Missions were no longer strategic, they were desperate. Planets changed hands like cards. Republic victories came with too much loss. Separatist defeats never lasted. And the clones, they kept fighting. Each rotation brought fewer back. Shaak Ti knew their names, their cadet records, their behavioral profiles. She memorized the faces even when they didn't survive long enough to earn a designation outside a number. She started keeping a list, not for the Order, not for history, for herself. It wasn't written on any datapad, it lived in her memory. A quiet roll call whispered in the dark long after the lights in her quarters dimmed. Hark, Lancer, Tuck, Bryn, Stone. Each one different, each one real. She once spoke to a group of injured troopers during recovery. No rank, no formal address, just words. "You are not mistakes," she told them. "You were not born wrong. You were not born weak." One of them, still too young to have earned his armor, blinked through bruised eyes and asked, "Then why did they make us the same?" That night, she didn't sleep. The clones had started to ask questions no Jedi wanted to answer. Not because they were rebellious, but because they were beginning to understand something the Jedi had ignored. They were alive, and alive things remember. Shaak Ti knew the danger of this, that one day these questions could grow into something larger, something the Republic couldn't control. But she didn't fear it. What she feared was what would happen if they didn't ask. If the clones never looked up from their helmets, if they never looked back. Because the longer they marched without reflection, the easier it became to forget they were marching toward an end designed by someone else. And the Jedi, for all their teachings, had become part of that design. Shaak Ti couldn't stop the war, couldn't stop the training, couldn't stop the Council's silence. But she could look back. So they would know someone did, even if the rest of the galaxy chose not to see. There were days she stood in the chamber where new batches were activated. She watched them wake for the first time, eyes opening in perfect rhythm, limbs stretching in rehearsed sequence, each one breathing in as if they already knew what was expected of them. They didn't cry, they didn't speak, they followed. And every time, Shaak Ti felt it again, the sharp, quiet edge of doubt. These weren't weapons, not yet. They were lives, barely begun, and already claimed. The Kaminoans called it progress, the Republic called it victory, the Jedi called it necessary. Shaak Ti couldn't call it anything anymore, because something had shifted. Not in the clones, in her. The more she saw them sent away, the more she questioned what they were being sent into, and why. She had once believed that war could be guided, that the Jedi would lead with compassion, that the clones at the very least would be respected, not for their programming, but for their sacrifice. But Kamino showed her something else. It showed her that the war was never about guidance, it was about supply, speed, scale. And the Jedi were just another part of the machine. She remembered one clone, CT 4989, quiet, sharp, precise. He asked her what made a Jedi different from a general. She told him it was peace, that Jedi sought it, fought only when forced. He blinked once, then asked, "Then why do you sleep here?" She didn't answer, because the question was too honest. Shaak Ti had begun living on Kamino, no longer traveling, no longer attending council meetings in person. She sent her votes remotely, wrote her reports with careful words, made herself small within the system. Not because she was hiding, because she was watching. And what she saw terrified her. The clones weren't just becoming soldiers. They were becoming obedient in ways no life should be. She started noticing it in the training yards, in the way commands were followed without hesitation, without blink, in the speed with which orders were obeyed, not just from Jedi, but from anyone in authority. It wasn't staunch loyalty. It was conditioning, something more complete than devotion, something colder than faith. It was control. One night, she accessed restricted files, medical logs, genetic sequencing, neurological pattern reports. And in those files, she found something she wasn't meant to see. A protocol, hidden, buried, locked behind layers of clearance even the Jedi weren't granted. She didn't know its full purpose, but she knew what it meant. There was a line in the data, in the event of contingency, command will be absolute. It wasn't Jedi language, it wasn't Republic language. It was something else, something outside her reach. She stared at the words long after the screen dimmed. And in her chest, the weight she had carried since the war began turned into something heavier. Not guilt, not fear, grief. Grief for what the clones were becoming. Grief for what the Jedi were helping build. Grief for the truth that wouldn't fit into any council report. This was something they should never have made. But it was too late. The army was here. The war was alive. And the silence in the Force, that soft hum she used to feel even in the dark, had grown so faint she wondered if it had left her completely. She closed the terminal, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark, listening to the rain. The same rain that never stopped, the same rain that had greeted her when she first arrived. Now, it was all that remained between her and the truth. That one day, the clones would follow an order the Jedi couldn't see coming. And she wouldn't be able to stop it. She didn't remember the moment she ignited her saber, only the silence that came just before it. It wasn't like the drills, it wasn't like the duels back in the temple. This time, there was no ceremony, no breath control, no stances to open with. There was only one thing standing between her and death, and it was already moving. General Grievous didn't speak when he struck. He didn't taunt, didn't posture. His movements weren't like a warrior's. They were like a machine reacting to stimulus. Blades spun from 4 arms. His cloak dropped in tatters. The floor shattered beneath his weight. And Shaak Ti moved. Not fast enough to meet him blow for blow. Not strong enough to match the momentum of his cybernetic frame. But precise enough to last more than a second. Sharp enough to avoid the first strike, and the second. She had known he would come, not exactly when, not exactly how, but she had felt it, in the growing pressure on Coruscant, in the unease that buzzed through the Force each time a new front opened. The Republic was closing in on Utapau, the Separatists were making their final moves. She had stayed behind when others left the temple, not because she was afraid to fight, but because someone had to be near the heart, someone had to guard what still mattered. She didn't expect to survive the encounter, not against the monster who wore Jedi sabers like trophies. But death had never frightened her. It was what came after that did. The battle moved fast, too fast for the senators watching to follow, too fast for the guards. Grievous didn't slow down for fear or confusion. He moved like a storm, shaped only by destruction. Shaak Ti moved like memory, quiet, intentional, never the same twice. She didn't strike to kill, she struck to survive. Each parry designed to lead him off balance, Each dodge meant to draw him away from the Chancellor's chamber. She knew what he wanted, knew why he was here, but she also knew something else. He didn't need to win, he just needed the galaxy to see how close he had come. She tried to outlast him, but she wasn't fighting Grievous alone. She was fighting what he represented. The failure of the Jedi to see the war clearly. The illusion of control, the weight of every youngling trained while the Order crumbled from within. Each strike reminded her of it. Each blow pushed her closer to that edge. Until the moment she slipped. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even visible. Her foot caught water from a shattered pipe, her shoulder turned just a fraction slower, and his blade came for her neck. If it weren't for the Force, she wouldn't have ducked in time. She felt the heat of the saber pass inches from her skin, heard the hiss, smelled the metal burn. And then, nothing. Grievous retreated, escaped. The Chancellor was safe, but something inside her wasn't set. Later, others would call it a success, a victory, proof that Jedi Masters could still hold the line. But she knew better. She hadn't set one. She had survived. Barely. She didn't speak of it afterward. She filed the report, gave the details, explained the breach. But she didn't write about the part where she realized how fast she could have died, how unprepared even she was for the reality of what the war had created. Grievous wasn't instead a warrior. He was a reflection of what happened when the Republic stopped caring about the cost of victory, of what the Jedi would become if they lost the last pieces of themselves trying to match him. Shaak Ti stood in the meditation chambers that night, staring at her reflection in the mirrored floor. No blood, no burns. But something inside her was different. The blade that came for her hadn't just been meant to kill. It had been meant to remind her that she was no longer fighting an enemy. She was fighting the shadow of everything they'd allowed to grow while they were looking the other way. The wound didn't set bleed. It wasn't set physical, but it followed her. After Grievous vanished into the lower levels, after the Chancellor was declared safe, after the corridors had been cleaned and the bodies removed, Shaak Ti still felt it. The hum of his blades, the weight of his steps, the cold, sharp rhythm of his movements, like metal remembering how to hate. She had seen many forms of war, starfighters burning through the sky, clones falling by the hundreds on unfamiliar soil, Jedi cutting through droids they never had time to understand. But none of it felt like this. This wasn't Sith war. This was anatomy fighting extinction. Grievous was more than an enemy. He was a question, one the Jedi hadn't answered quickly enough. What happens when rage survives death? He had once been a warrior, a Kaleesh general with pain in his blood and ash in his lungs, and now he was armor. Machinery, hate wrapped in bone. The Jedi used to believe that the Force could guide all living things, but Grievous was no longer alive, not fully, not in the way it mattered. His breath came through tubes, his heart, if it still beat, was buried beneath layers of separation. She had felt nothing from him, no anger, no fear, no distortion in the Force. Only absence. The kind of emptiness that made her question whether the Jedi had already lost, not in battle, but in what they were now required to fight. She replayed the duel in her mind, again and again, not to relive it, but to understand. Why did instead she strike harder? Why didn't she try to finish it? She told herself the mission was to protect the Chancellor, that survival was the goal, that her instincts had served the greater cause. But in the quiet, she knew the truth. She hadn't held back because of fear. She had held back because something inside her still believed that even he, the monster cloaked in iron, might still be more than what he'd been made into. And that belief nearly killed her. The other masters didn't ask for details. Mace Windu simply nodded when she returned to the temple. Yoda gave her a long glance, as if he could feel the weight she carried but wouldn't name it. She spoke only what was needed. But she didn't meditate afterward. She didn't sleep. She wandered the temple corridors alone, remembering the way Grievous moved, the way he never paused, never blinked, never questioned. The Jedi had trained themselves to trust the Force, to flow with it, but Grievous was built to override instinct. He didn't trust anything. He simply executed. And the worst part wasn't that the Republic couldn't stop him. The worst part was that the Republic was starting to look more like him every day. Steel, command, obedience. The clones, the factories, the data streams, the orders sent faster than wisdom could catch up. Flesh was being replaced, and with it, understanding. Shaak Ti looked down at her own hands, scarred, calloused, real. But she had started to feel out of place. The battlefield no longer welcomed feeling, it rewarded function. And that made Grievous stronger every day, even when he wasn't present. She returned to the council chamber the next morning. She spoke little, voted when called, discussed troop movement, reviewed briefings. But every time someone said efficiency, she heard compliance. Every time someone said victory, she heard cost. And every time someone said necessary, she thought of the blade that missed her throat by less than a second. Grievous didn't win that fight, but he left a message. Not just to her, to all of them. That something had already changed. And no one had noticed until it was standing in front of them, wearing stolen lightsabers, moving like death without a soul. It used to be sacred. The temple wasn't just a structure, it was memory, a place where the Force felt thick in the air, where the stones whispered of peace long before war became routine. Younglings once ran through its halls, archives held scrolls older than the Republic itself. The chamber walls echoed with questions, not commands. But war had found its way inside. Not with weapons, not with fire, with urgency. The pace quickened, meetings grew shorter, meditations skipped, trials shortened, clones walked the corridors now. Couriers in armor, security reinforcements, strategists in the war room annex. Shaak Ti watched it all change and did nothing to stop it. Because there was no stopping it. Not anymore. The Jedi had become soldiers, not in title but in rhythm. They moved with the war's tempo, slept with one eye open, measured their worth not in wisdom but in survival. Even the younglings felt it. They still trained, still laughed, sometimes. But their eyes watched the skies more often. Wonder had been replaced with worry. Shaak Ti saw it in how they flinched at the sound of transports landing, how they whispered when names were read aloud in the memorial chambers. They were too young to understand what they were sensing, but they felt it, that the war wasn't set just outside. It had taken root here. She spent more time walking the outer corridors at night, the ones overlooking the city. Ships passed in endless lanes of light. The sky never dimmed, only changed color. Even the stars were hard to see now. And somewhere beyond all that, in shadows not lit by traffic lanes or Senate towers, the Sith still moved. Shaak Ti had never seen Sidious, had never heard his voice, or felt his presence. But she didn't need to, because his touch was already here. Not like a poison, like a fog, slow, seeping, wrapping itself around decision after decision, until nothing felt clear anymore. She watched her fellow masters grow tired, saw how their robes hung looser, how their voices lost rhythm, how their conviction became narrower, sharper, defensive. Even Master Kenobi, once so centered, had started speaking with less patience. Shaak didn't blame them. They were fighting a war they hadn't started, trying to defend a galaxy that didn't want balance, only control. She stood in the meditation chamber one morning. As the sun cracked through the high windows, light hit the floor in patterns she used to trace with her hands as a Padawan. But this time, it felt like intrusion. Like even the sun no longer knew how to shine here. She kneeled, tried to listen, but the force didn't set answer. Not like before. It was still there, she could feel it, but quieter, like it had pulled itself deeper, waiting, watching. Not gone, just waiting for them to stop. She heard footsteps behind her, soft, armored. It was one of the clone commanders, Fox. He paused respectfully, waiting. She rose slowly. "Master," he said, "there's been a disturbance near the east landing pad. No threat, just activity." She nodded, didn't ask for details, walked with him in silence. And as they moved through the temple halls, she felt it again, the shift. Not a scream, not even a voice. Just absence. Like something sacred had slipped between the cracks, and no one had noticed. They reached the pad, nothing urgent, just a delayed transport, a slight miscommunication. The kind of mistake that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago. But now everyone was tired. Shaak Ti stood there for a while after the troopers cleared out, looking up at the sky. And for a brief second, she thought she saw something, a star, maybe, or a shadow. It didn't matter. Because she knew what it meant. The war had touched everything. Even here. Even this. And the temple, the last place that felt like home, was no longer untouched. It was part of the battlefield now. Just quieter. They called Grievous a monster. It was easy. It made sense. His limbs weren't his voice was fractured, metal wrapped around flesh. He wore the sabers of the Jedi he had killed. He spoke with bitterness and moved with precision. He didn't negotiate. He didn't hesitate. He destroyed. But Shaak Ti had seen monsters before, and they didn't always look like that. Monsters didn't need claws, they didn't need armor. Sometimes they wore robes. Sometimes they smiled through Senate speeches, sat in high towers, drafted laws, moved fleets, pulled strings no one else could see. Sometimes they shook her hand and thanked her for her service. That was harder to look at than Grievous. Because Grievous didn't lie. He didn't hide what he was. But the men who built him, the ones who used him, they still called themselves saviors. Shaak Ti had read the reports, saw how much of Grievous was engineered. Cybernetic lung enhancement, neural reinforcement, skeleton replaced with durasteel, reflexes bypassed for speed. But they left one thing untouched. His hate. The war fed that, made it useful. The separatists needed a symbol, a weapon that felt unstoppable, something to make the Republic flinch. And so they took what was left of a broken warrior and turned him into fear itself. She had studied the design logs, not in public records, but in the secure files the Jedi were allowed to see and never talk about. Dooku had overseen much of it, but he hadn't built Grievous alone. There were scientists, military strategists, engineers, a whole network of minds who had turned a breathing creature into a blade. And the Republic wasn't set blameless either. They had seen it, fought him, adapted to him, but never once asked how he came to be. Because they were too busy building weapons of their own. Kamino, the clones, the shift in strategy, Jedi becoming generals, younglings trained to hold lightsabers with tighter grips. The line between necessity and cruelty was gone. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Shaak Ti was still trying to be a Jedi. She still meditated, still listened to the Force even when it was distant, still walked the corridors without speaking unless she had to. But she was tired. Not from the battles, not from Grievous, from pretending that this was what the Jedi were meant to become. She stood one night in the war room, a vast chamber lined with glowing holotables, clone strategists, Jedi tacticians. Lines were drawn, systems targeted, plans approved. And she watched as another campaign was planned around acceptable losses. She asked if there was another way. A longer path, a slower one with fewer casualties. They thanked her for the input, then moved on. She didn't speak again that day. The next morning she returned to the temple archives. Not to study, not to record, to remember. She walked past scrolls older than Coruscant itself, past tapestries from a time when the Jedi didn't fight, when they only listened, only healed. She sat alone in the center chamber, in silence, and whispered a question into the Force. When did we stop being who we were? No answer came. But she wasn't set expecting one. The Force didn't stake like it used to. It watched now, quiet, still, like it was waiting. Grievous would attack again. The war would continue. The Senate would vote. The clones would fight. The Jedi would lead. And the monster the galaxy feared would keep hunting. But Shaak Ti wasn't afraid of Grievous anymore. She was afraid of what he revealed. That beasts weren't set born. They were made by fear, by war, by men in suits. She noticed it long before anyone else spoke about it. The way his footsteps changed, how his silence grew longer, how the space around Anakin Skywalker felt heavier each time he passed through the temple halls. He had always been different. From the moment he arrived, the council had debated him more than they taught him. There was always noise around Anakin, fear, hope, doubt, but never quiet. Until now. Now he barely spoke. When he did, it was careful, controlled, not with calm but with effort. Shaak Ti observed him from a distance at first, not out of distrust, but because she knew what it meant when someone began to carry weight they couldn't share. She had seen it in other Jedi, the way trauma carved them from the inside before it ever showed on the surface. But Anakin was younger, louder, quicker to move, slower to heal. And this time, the scars weren't sit hidden. He walked past her one evening outside the archives, didn't nod, didn't glance, just kept walking, his robe torn slightly at the edge, his mechanical hand clenched tight enough to hum. She didn't stop him, she just watched. Later that night, she found him alone in one of the upper chambers, the ones where the stars still managed to pierce the haze of Coruscant. He didn't look at her when she entered. "Is this what we were trained for?" he asked, softly. "All of this?" Shaak Ti didn't answer, not yet. He turned slightly, not to face her, just to breathe. "I see Jedi dying. I see soldiers obeying without question. I see senators buying victory with silence." Then, finally, he looked at her. "And I'd some told to be patient." Shaak Ti stepped closer, slowly, like she was approaching something fragile. "Patience isn't said silence," she said, "and obedience isn't said clarity." He scoffed, a sound too bitter for someone his age. "You all say the same things: balance, peace, let go. And none of that has helped you," she replied, quietly. That stopped him. He didn't expect her to say that. She sat beside him. No robes, no rank, just a tired Jedi, next to another one. "You carry too much," she said. He looked away again. "I don't get to put it down." There was nothing in the code that prepared them for this conversation. No script to follow. No path that ended in certainty. Shaak Ti had never tried to fix him. That wasn't what he needed. He didn't trust repair. He trusted survival, movement, action. So she gave him only one thing: stillness. For several minutes, they said nothing. The stars blinked above, Coruscant breathed below, and Anakin Skywalker sat in silence without having to explain it. But she saw something behind his eyes, something deeper than anger. Fear. Not of war, not of death. Fear of what he might do next. He left before sunrise. Didn't speak again, just nodded once. That was the last real conversation they ever had. The next time she stood near him in the council chamber, he didn't look at her, and she didn't push, because she had already felt the door close. Whatever was growing inside him now didn't want to be stopped. It wanted to be hidden. And Shaak Ti knew what came next. When someone stopped asking questions, when they stopped listening, when they started to believe they were alone, she had seen it in others, but never this close, and never this quiet. There was a silence in the temple that didn't belong. It didn't announce itself. It didn't carry anger. It moved between shadows and tucked itself into corners, sitting in the quiet spaces left behind by Jedi who no longer returned from missions. Shaak Ti felt it more than she could describe. It wasn't instead fear. It was waiting. The kind of silence that existed just before something broke. Anakin's behavior wasn't the only thing changing. The council was restless. They spoke more frequently about the Chancellor, about his influence, about his presence in matters once far outside his reach. Shaak Ti noticed how many times his name came up, even when he wasn't present, especially when he wasn't. Palpatine wasn't just a figurehead anymore. He was a variable, an unavoidable one. The Jedi walked a narrow path, guarding the Republic, obeying the Senate, fighting a war they never chose, and now they were being asked to spy on the man who ran all of it. Some said yes without hesitation. Shaak Ti didn't start to answer. Not because she refused, but because something inside her knew the question was already too late. Darkness didn't need masks anymore. It didn't sit hide. It simply blended into the noise. She wandered the temple, often, alone, unannounced. Her presence rarely noticed. Most assumed she was meditating, or reviewing clone behavior, or coordinating battle reports. She was doing none of those things. She was listening. To the halls. To the Force. And more, she was hearing nothing. She stood outside the chambers where the younglings trained, fewer than before, quieter than before. She watched them move through lightsaber forms with effort, not joy. They were learning faster, not because they were ready, but because the Council had shortened the path. She had once believed that a Jedi's life was shaped slowly, over years of careful guidance. Now, it felt like everyone was being rushed to the end of something. She stopped walking when she saw it. A flicker. Barely a breath in the Force, a disturbance. It came from the main corridor leading to the holocron vault. Nothing moved, no alarms, but something passed through that space, something that didn't belong. Not a person, a presence. She stepped forward, slowly, reached out. But it was already gone. Not gone, hidden, buried. She spoke of it to no one, because she understood what it meant. Something dark had entered the temple. Not recently, not suddenly. It had been here for a long time, and now it had grown strong enough to leave traces behind. Not in bodies, in the walls, in the stillness. She found herself returning to her own quarters more often, not to rest. She didn't sleep much anymore, but to think, to prepare. She no longer believed the temple was safe. Not because of what was outside, because of what was within. It was the same feeling she'd known as a child, hiding in tall grass, feeling a predator she couldn't see, just beyond the tree line. Except this time, the predator wasn't coming through the gates. It had already been invited inside. She stopped trying to warn them. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't surrender. It was understanding. The Council didn't see it, not fully. They saw the Republic cracking, the war fraying, Anakin slipping further into silence, but they still thought there was time. Still believed the temple was a place of light, untouched by the rot growing at its center. Shaak Ti had seen enough to know otherwise. She began to keep watch. Not officially, not with orders, but in quiet ways, ways the temple wouldn't notice unless they were looking closely. She rose earlier, moved slower, took longer routes between meetings, paused more often near training rooms, meditation halls, transport pads, side corridors. Always listening, always watching. She didn't expect to stop what was coming. That wasn't the purpose. It was to witness it. to be present if the end came, so someone could remember what it looked like when the Jedi fell from the inside. She saw things others didn't set, knights passing one another without speaking. A growing number of guards at the temple gates, clones, not Jedi. Master Windu carrying tension in his jaw, even when seated in silence. Even the younglings felt it. She could see it in their posture, straighter, stiffer. They trained like soldiers now, not like students. Shaak Ti stopped correcting it, because correction implied this was a phase, and she no longer believed it was. One evening she stood in the Hall of Reflection, alone. This was the place Jedi once came to meditate on failure, to sit with regret, to learn from it. Now the room was empty. Dust gathered near the edges of the benches. No one came here anymore. No one had time. Shaak sat in the center of the room, letting the silence settle. She thought of the clones, the ones she couldn't protect. She thought of the children, the ones training for wars they didn't understand. She thought of Anakin, and how he had already made his choice, even if he didn't know it yet. She remembered the way he used to laugh, rare as it was. She hadn't heard it in months. What had replaced it wasn't anger. It was stillness, but not the kind the Jedi valued. It was the stillness of someone waiting for permission to let go. She stood again, walked the perimeter of the hall, let her fingers brush the old inscriptions. The Force flows through all things. Peace is the path. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. She whispered the words, not as mantras, but as memories, because that sets what they were now. Pieces of a way of life she had already begun mourning, long before anyone else admitted it was dying. Later that night, she walked past the council chamber. The doors were closed, the lights dimmed. Inside, no voices argued, no strategies formed, just silence. Shaak Ti stood in the doorway for a long time, saying nothing, then turned and kept watch, because someone had to. She could have left. Many had, some called away by war, others by fear. Even among the council, absences grew more common. Jedi were needed everywhere. The temple was no longer the center of the order. It was just another post in a war that never ended. But Shaak Ti stayed. Not because she believed it would be safe, because she knew it wouldn't just be. The darkness she had sensed had not passed. It had only grown more familiar. She saw it in the shadows of the halls, in the subtle hesitations of younglings during lightsaber drills, in the way masters whispered between missions, avoiding the word they feared would make it real, full. Not just of the Republic, not just of the Order, but of something deeper, the connection that once held it all together. She spent her last weeks like a ghost, present but unspoken, moving through corridors no one else walked, sitting through meetings where her voice was no longer needed. She wasn't forgotten, but she wasn't followed either, because everyone was too busy trying to win something they no longer understood. She watched as Anakin walked into the council chamber with eyes that didn't match the boy who once asked her why the stars looked different on Coruscant. He was no longer questioning. He was preparing. There was nothing left to say, so she stopped speaking. Instead, she returned to the lower levels of the temple, the silent places where echoes of the past still lingered. The room of 1,000 fountains, the empty meditation gardens, the high balconies where Padawans once whispered dreams they no longer dared to speak aloud. She touched the stones, feeling the pulse of memories woven into them. Not visions, not prophecy, just stillness, and something that felt like goodbye. Shaak Ti didn't wait for orders, didn't ask for guidance. She returned to her quarters. She packed nothing. She walked to the temple's interior sanctuary, a chamber few ever entered unless seeking complete solitude. She sat in the center, and she listened. To the Force, to the silence, to whatever came next. When the sky broke open hours later and fire began to rain from the upper platforms, she didn't rise. When the blaster fire reached the outer gates, she closed her eyes. And when the doors to the sanctuary finally opened and the clone troopers entered with weapons drawn, she didn't draw hers. Because this was the end she had already felt coming. Not one of glory, not one of defiance, but one of witness. Shaak Ti stayed not because she thought she could stop it, but because someone had to see it. Someone had to remain until the last breath of the temple faded into dust, so that if anything survived, if any echo remained, it would know that not everyone turned away, that one Jedi stayed to see the last light fade. She felt it before it began. Not through alarms, not through panic, through the Force, the kind of disturbance that doesn't arrive in waves, but all at once, like a string pulled too tight, and then a snap. She was already awake when the temple shook. Not physically, spiritually. Something cracked open above her, a void that didn't roar, didn't scream. It simply arrived, cold, absolute. And inside it, him, Anakin. But not the boy. Not the young man who once asked if there was still peace left in the galaxy. That part of him was gone now, buried beneath something that no longer questioned. She didn't rise right away, didn't reach for her saber. She sat in the dark of the sanctuary, her hands resting calmly on her knees. Outside her chamber, the footsteps grew louder. Boots, not bare feet. Troopers, not Jedi. And something heavier between them, like metal dragging grief behind it. Order 66 had not been spoken aloud in the temple yet, but it was already being obeyed. She listened. To the hallway. To the dying quiet of the Force. To the voices fading one by one as the halls filled with fire. She could have run, could have warned the others, could have ignited her saber and met the moment with resistance. But she didn't stat, because the temple was already gone. Not in fire, in purpose. This was the moment the Jedi had failed to prevent, the one she had watched approach for years, slowly, quietly, like a shadow beneath their feet, and now it had risen. Shaak Ti stood without a word, moved through the sanctuary toward the high inner chamber. No guards, no lights, just stillness. The last place in the temple untouched by fear. She didn't dare look back. There was nothing behind her now but memory. She felt every death as it happened, across the lower levels, in the youngling halls, in the council chamber, each one like a candle pinched shut. Some fought. Some didn't dare. But none of them saw him coming. Not like this. The one who had been their prophecy, their hope, their burden. He moved like a wound made flesh, a silence that walked. And when he reached her chamber, the door opened without resistance. There are many stories of what happened next. Some say she rose with her saber in hand, ready to fight. Others say she fell in meditation, never lifting a blade at all. But the truth is quieter. Shaak Ti did not speak. She only looked up and saw the end standing in front of her. And she recognized him. Even beneath the eyes that no longer belonged to the boy she once watched train in silence. Even beneath the breath that no longer carried doubt. He stood there, waiting. And so did she. Because some deaths are not battles. They serve choices. The galaxy never agreed on how she died. Some records claimed it was Anakin's blade, a swift, silent execution during the temple purge. Others said it was slower, more deliberate, like a ritual, that she sat down, crossed her legs, and let herself pass before the door even opened. Neither account could be proven, because no one truly saw her death. But the Force did. And the Force remembered. The Jedi archives marked her as fallen during the siege of the temple. That was all. A line of data, a name among others, but none of it told the truth. Not the kind of truth that breathes inside the walls or lingers in the air long after the body is gone. The truth was that Shaak Ti had already begun to leave long before the temple fell. Her spirit was quieting, not out of fear, not out of resignation, but because she no longer believed she was needed. Not like this. Not in a war where sabers answered questions that meditation never had time to ask. For years she'd tried to keep the center still, tried to hold the balance from within. She taught, she watched, she waited. But every year the war grew louder than the teachings. The council turned their ears toward battle maps and encrypted communiques. Even the younglings practiced saber forms more than they practiced silence. The Jedi had started listening to the galaxy instead of the Force. She didn't blame them. She didn't even feel anger anymore, just sadness. So by the time the war finally reached their doorstep, when its monster wore the face of a former student, she didn't reach for vengeance. She prepared for something smaller. Peace. An ending that wasn't set loud. It wasn't stunned weakness. It wasn't stunned surrender. It was trust that the Force would remember her without violence. And maybe, in the echo of her passing, others would hear what had gone quiet. There are those who still insist she fought, that she leapt at Anakin with her saber lit, defending the temple with her final breath. They prefer this ending, because it sounds braver, looks stronger, fits the narrative of a warrior who stood to the last. But that wasn't set her way. Shaak Ti didn't believe strength always came through resistance. She believed in stillness, in observation, in letting go of what could no longer be guided. And in that final moment, whether he raised his blade or not, she chose to meet the darkness with calm. Her heart slowed, her breathing softened. And somewhere inside the Force, she stepped away, not defeated, not broken, just done. It's perhaps why no one truly felt her die. Because she didn't die like the others. She didn't scream. She didn't fall. She simply disappeared, like a breath leaving the galaxy. And maybe that's why so many stories were written, because it was easier to imagine her ending in fire than in silence. She had fought many times before. Geonosis, Hypori, Felucia, even Kamino's training halls. She knew how to kill, how to defend, how to survive. But in the end, she chose none of it. There were no enemies to outmaneuver, no commands to follow, no younglings at her side. Only the hum of the temple and the faint pressure in the air, like a storm building just beyond the walls. Shaak Ti sat alone in the meditation chamber, deeper inside the temple than most knew existed. A quiet place, sacred, not because it held power, but because it asked nothing in return. Her saber rested beside her, not on her belt, not in her hand, just there, still, silent, unused. She had spent the day sensing tremors in the Force, sudden shifts, like futures collapsing, possibilities erased before they could bloom. The Force was screaming, but not with words, with loss. It didn't tell her names, didn't show her visions, but it didn't need to. She already knew what was coming. There had been no contact from the Council for hours. Communications from the Outer Rim had gone dark. Clones were moving inside the temple, but not in formation, not in service. She had felt them pass, room by room, hall by hall. Each step heavier than the last. And still, she didn't run. She didn't even rise. Because this wasn't something she could stop, and more than that, it wasn't something she should. That was the decision no one ever understood. That a Jedi could choose to stay still while the fire approached. Because for all the lessons the Order had given, it had forgotten one. Sometimes to serve the Force, you had to leave the fight. She had spoken with Anakin not long before. She had seen the weight behind his eyes, the storm waiting to break loose. She had offered no warnings, no cryptic lessons, just understanding. Maybe that had been her final act, letting him know he had been seen, not as a weapon, not as a prophecy, but as a boy who had never been allowed peace. Now, peace was all she could give. So she folded her hands. She straightened her spine. And she did what few Jedi ever truly learned to do. She waited. The sound of footsteps came. Not hurried, not hesitant, purposeful, heavy. She felt the presence before the door opened. Anakin Skywalker. Or whatever remained of him. She didn't look. She didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and let the Force surround her like water. Her saber stayed on the floor. She was not afraid. Not of pain, not of death, not even of failure. Because she had done what she was meant to do. And now, she would leave without taking another life. That was her final discipline. The last lesson she taught, not through words, but through silence. And maybe in time someone would find the echo. Someone would understand. The records didn't say much. Some claimed her body was found beside the younglings. Others said she had perished on Felucia, far from the temple in a battle that blurred into myth. One holocron placed her death on Kamino. Another had no mention at all. The truth had never been loud enough to win. Because her death wasn't made for records. It wasn't broadcast, it wasn't witnessed. It didn't shape a battle or a turning point. It shaped something smaller, but maybe more permanent. The soul of the temple. While the walls cracked and flames climbed the spires, while blasters carved paths where students had once run, while Anakin Skywalker dragged his name through ash and blood, Shaak Ti disappeared into stillness. No one saw it happen. No guards, no Jedi, not even the clones hunting her. Because her death didn't happen in fire. It happened in surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but of understanding. She had lived long enough to know that some wars were built to consume their builders. The Jedi hadn't lost the war in a battle. They lost it in the silence between battles, in the compromises, the obedience, the hope that loyalty would protect them from betrayal. She didn't hate the clones. She didn't blame Anakin. She didn't even curse the Council, because that would mean she still expected more from them. But in those last moments, she asked nothing. Not from the Force. Not from fate. Not even from herself. Her passing was so quiet that even the Force seemed to pause, as if watching a thread unwind from the tapestry without tearing it. And then, she was gone. The meditation chamber remained, untouched, undamaged. Days later, when the Empire took full control, a group of troopers entered that level. They found no body, no saber, just a room that felt colder than it should have. A console left open, and on it, a faint imprint. Not a message, not a log, just a small pulse of energy, like something had passed through the space and left part of itself behind. Some said she had vanished into the Force itself, that she had followed the same path Qui-Gon had begun, and Yoda later walked. But there was no glow, no fading silhouette, no voice in the wind. Just absence. And sometimes, absence speaks loudest. Years passed. The temple became a symbol of imperial control, a place of triumph, rewritten for new rulers. But deep in the underlevels, where no one walked, the chamber remained sealed, not by order, not by lock, but by a feeling, as if the Force still remembered what she had done. Not in action, but in choice. The choice not to fight, not to flee, but to end with clarity. Shaak Ti, name faded from archives. Her story broke into conflicting legends, but something older than memory carried her forward. Some Jedi became heroes, some became ghosts. She became stillness, and in that stillness, in the breath between wars, she left behind the only victory that could not be stolen: peace. The Jedi Temple was silent now, not from peace, but from absence. The halls that once echoed with the footsteps of younglings, with the hum of lightsabers, with voices debating truth and duty, were hollow. But silence does not mean emptiness. Some voices didn't vanish. They sank deeper into the Force, and Shaak Ti's was one of them. She had not died loudly. No grand battle, no final scream, no storm of sabers, but her passing rippled, not through headlines, not through the records the Empire would forge, but in quiet, personal ways, through the hearts of those who had once stood near her, through choices made in moments of doubt, through restraint where others would have drawn blood. Her absence was a kind of presence. Yoda knew it first. Or perhaps he felt it last. In his exile on Dagobah, surrounded by fog and memories too old to organize, he would sometimes sit still for hours, not meditating, just remembering. And when he remembered Shaak Ti, it was not as a warrior or council member. He remembered how she never raised her voice, how she spoke to children like they were equals, how, even during war, she avoided hate. That was rare. But the Jedi didn't fall because they hated. They fell because they didn't see. And Yoda had seen too late that Shaak Ti had tried, not to change the galaxy, but to change them. One conversation at a time, one warning at a time. She had sensed the shift, not just in Anakin, but in everything. The fear, the secrecy, the way the Order had grown too proud to listen to itself. Her lessons didn't always come in lectures. Sometimes they came in silence, when she let others speak, even when she disagreed, or when she offered no defense for her own decisions, because she knew the future would judge them better than she could. That kind of humility doesn't fit well in war. It doesn't win applause, but it stays, long after fire ends. Ahsoka felt it too, even after leaving the Order, especially after leaving. There were moments in the Clone Wars, moments of chaos, betrayal, confusion, when her instincts screamed one thing, and her training screamed another. And in the middle of that storm, it was Shaak Ti's calm voice she heard, not telling her what to do, just reminding her to pause. That pause saved lives. Ahsoka never spoke publicly about Shaak Ti's death. She didn't have to, because in the way she moved, in the way she spoke to others, especially to clones, to people used and thrown away, Shaak Ti's memory lived, not as a monument, but as a habit. Then there were the clones themselves. Most had never trained directly under her, not like they did with Kenobi or Skywalker. But Kamino had long shadows, and Shaak Ti was one of them. She watched over the cloning facilities not like a soldier overseeing a factory, but like someone guarding a truth no one wanted to face. She knew the clones weren't just tools. That's why the Kaminoans resented her. She saw the faces behind the numbers. She didn't treat them like replacements, and because of that, some of them, even years later, even after everything, would speak of her with a kind of reverence, quiet, private, the kind of respect that doesn't shout. When Order 66 came, and the Temple fell, the Force didn't just lose a Jedi, it lost a counterweight. Someone who had refused to become a blade, someone who understood that peace wasn't something you enforced, it was something you protected, even when no one noticed. And the Force noticed. In strange ways, in scattered places, her echo continued. It moved through Yoda's sorrow, through Ahsoka's patience, through the guilt of clones who knew something had gone wrong, even if they couldn't name it. Shaak Ti never became a symbol, never tried to, but what lingers in the Force isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who leave the deepest marks. Regret doesn't sound like a scream. It sounds like breathing. Heavy, slow, like the weight of things left undone pressing against the chest. And for those who survived the Jedi Purge, that weight didn't fade with time. It thickened, wrapped around memory, pressed into the Force like fingerprints. Yoda, who once spoke in riddles and wisdom, found fewer words in exile, not because he had nothing left to teach, but because the failure of the Jedi was no longer a theory to debate. It was a wound that would never close, and Shaak Ti, had been one of the few who saw the infection spreading before the collapse. He remembered her final warnings, not in exact words, those were gone, but in her eyes, in how she had looked at Anakin, how she had looked at the clones. She knew something was wrong, not in the plans or politics, but in the silence between Jedi, between teacher and student, the silence that crept in when truth became too inconvenient to speak. Shaak Ti had stayed behind, not because she believed she could win, but because someone had to remain. Someone had to be there when the temple fell, not to stop it, but to feel it happen, to anchor the pain in the Force so it would not be forgotten. That kind of decision leaves a scar, not just on the one who made it, but on those left behind. When Obi-Wan wandered through the ruins of the temple, after the flames had died, after the bodies had cooled, he stopped at the place where Shaak Ti was said to have fallen. But there was no body, no blood, only her presence, like a breath held in the walls. He didn't cry. Jedi are trained not to, but something in him paused, as if he realized too late that she had been trying to tell them all along. That silence was not peace, that discipline was not detachment, that following orders was not the same as wisdom. The galaxy moved on. It always does, new wars, new empires, new rebellions, but every once in a while someone would ask about her, about the Jedi Master who vanished during the fall. The stories never matched. Some said Anakin killed her, others claimed she died meditating. A few believed she was still alive, lost somewhere in the Force. But the truth didn't need to be written down. It was already alive, inside the way Yoda paused before speaking, inside the way Ahsoka trusted her instincts over orders, inside the guilt that clung to the clone survivors who couldn't explain why they remembered her face when they couldn't remember others. Shaak Ti wasn't a leader in the traditional sense. She didn't command legions. She didn't rally the temple with speeches, but she left something behind that didn't burn. Restraint. The idea that not every fight was worth the lightsaber, that listening could be stronger than striking, that staying still when the galaxy rushes toward war is not cowardice, but clarity. Regret grew in those who ignored her, who brushed aside her quiet warnings. They thought she was soft, too careful, too reluctant to act. But now they understood. The galaxy had plenty of warriors. What it lacked was someone to hold space for silence, for breath, for the pain that comes before violence, the pain no one wants to acknowledge. Her regret wasn't loud. It didn't come from failure. It came from knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it. She didn't resist because she believed in victory. She stayed because she believed someone had to witness the fall with open eyes. And that is what left the mark. Not in books, not in archives, but in the quiet that followed her name. Ahsoka Tano didn't speak of Shaak Ti often, but she didn't have to. The way she moved, the way she hesitated before decisions, the way her voice steadied when others wavered, that was her answer. She had listened. Maybe not to every lesson, maybe not when it was easiest, but when it mattered most, Ahsoka had heard what others had ignored. She remembered the temple differently than most, not just the noise, the distant hum of younglings training, the echo of footsteps in the high halls, but the spaces between, the meditation chambers where Shaak Ti would sit alone, hours before dawn, barely moving, no saber in hand, no orders given, just stillness. Others thought her distant, detached, even weak. But Ahsoka had seen the truth in those silences. Shaak Ti wasn't quiet because she lacked strength. She was quiet because she understood where strength came from and what it cost. There were no dramatic lessons, no grand speeches, just the small things. A calm voice during a chaotic council meeting, a hand resting gently on a clone's shoulder, the way she once paused outside the youngling chambers after a mission, not to speak, just to listen. Ahsoka didn't fully understand those moments at the time. She was still young, shaped by Anakin's boldness, by the war's urgency. But after the fall, after the betrayals, after the silence returned, she found those memories waiting, not as answers, but as reminders. Shaak Ti had once told her, softly, the galaxy doesn't always need another warrior. Sometimes it needs a witness. Ahsoka hadn't known what to do with those words then. She does now. In the years that followed the purge, when Ahsoka wandered the stars in exile, hunted, grieving, rebuilding, she carried that sentence like a compass. She didn't fight for glory. She didn't seek revenge. She chose when to step in and when to walk away. Because she had learned something the Jedi never taught out loud, that survival was not always about resistance. Sometimes it was about remembering who you were before the war tried to change you. The Jedi had trained her to block, to strike, to lead, but Shaak Ti had shown her how to sit with uncertainty, how to move through a galaxy that didn't want Jedi anymore, without becoming something else entirely. Ahsoka didn't need to claim a legacy. She didn't need to wear a title. She became a presence, steady, quiet, decisive, not unlike the one she had once watched from a distance on the temple balconies. And when she finally stood alongside others again, Sabine, Ezra, Rex, they noticed, not just her skill, but her restraint. She didn't rush to speak. She listened. She didn't raise her saber first. She waited. She didn't argue when others doubted her. She watched. Because she had learned that not every truth needed to be shouted, some truths were stronger when they were lived. The Jedi Order had tried to teach detachment, but what Shaak Ti offered was something different: compassion without blindness, distance without abandonment, strength that didn't need to be proven. Even years after her death, even with the stories of her end blurred and uncertain, Ahsoka felt her, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a lesson still unfolding. Whenever Ahsoka hesitated, whenever she wondered if she should fight or walk away, if she should speak or stay silent, she would remember that quiet figure in the shadows of the temple. And the words would return. The galaxy doesn't always need another warrior. There were many Jedi who shaped Ahsoka, but Shaak Ti's influence ran deeper than most realized, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't heroic, it wasn't even visible to those who only measured strength by victories. It was patient, subtle, enduring. And in a galaxy where so much had burned, where legacies were often written in blood, hers survived in silence, carried forward by the student who had learned not just how to fight, but when not to. The temple was ash now, its statues broken, its archives erased, its halls hollowed by fire and screams, and yet the Force still remembered what had happened there. It carried echoes, whispers, the weight of choices made too late. Shaak Ti had tried to warn them, not with orders, not with panic, but with stillness. She had watched the storm form from within the eye, and when the winds came, she didn't raise her blade in defiance. She sat down, alone, and faced the darkness, as if it were an old truth finally returning. Others remembered her death through rumor. Some said Anakin killed her without hesitation. Others swore she died in meditation, letting go of life before it could be taken. But the Force told a quieter story, one without vengeance, without a final scream, just a last breath surrendered to peace, while the galaxy burned around her. The Republic had been warned, the Jedi Council had been warned, but power had its rhythm, and no one wanted to hear a song that didn't match the drums of war. Shaak Ti's restraint was dismissed as passivity, her silence mistaken for fear, and her absence in battle seen as failure. But she hadn't failed, she had chosen. She chose not to fight when fighting had become meaningless, not to argue when truth had already been buried, not to escape when the end was already written. That choice echoed louder than any last stand. Because she wasn't trying to save herself, she wasn't even trying to save the Order. She was bearing witness to its final fall, to the cost of pride, to the silence that follows when the Force has been ignored for too long. And though she died without resistance, her presence lingered, not as a martyr, not as a warning, but as a question that wouldn't fade. What if they had listened? Not just to her, but to everything the Force had been trying to say. What if the Jedi had looked inward, not outward? What if they had trusted stillness instead of strategy? What if they had remembered that power was not a shield, but a test? The galaxy didn't want saving. It wanted control. It wanted safety dressed as structure, and it wanted the Jedi to be weapons, not watchers. So it chose the fire. And in choosing that fire, it silenced the ones who refused to feed it. Shaak Ti wasn't the only voice ignored, but she was one of the last who tried to speak without demanding anything in return. Her quiet wasn't submission, it was clarity. She saw what others refused to see, that the Jedi were being used, not heard, that the Republic had already begun to rot from the inside, that the Clone Wars were not a battle for peace, but a theater for power to change hands. And when the curtain fell, when the Empire rose from the smoke, her voice was no longer there to say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. The ruins spoke for her. Even in the Empire's cold order, even in Palpatine's reshaped galaxy, something of her remained. In the quiet defiance of survivors, in the careful steps of Jedi who returned without robes, without temples, without names. And in Ahsoka, who never stopped hearing her, even when the rest of the galaxy forgot she had ever lived. Shaak Ti was not remembered by statues or battles, but by choices, small invisible ones. A pause before speaking, a refusal to raise a saber, a moment of silence in a room built for commands. These choices are easy to overlook, but they're the only ones that last. The fire came, the temple fell, and the Jedi became stories. But somewhere in the Force, there is still a memory of her sitting alone, calm, aware, waiting, not afraid of death, only aware that her time was over, and that what came next would not be hers to fix. Because some endings are not escapes, they are acknowledgments. And some Jedi do not fight to the last breath. They breathe out and disappear into the Force, not as warriors, but as witnesses. The clones had names, but most forgot them. In the beginning they were numbers, and for many that's all they remained. But Alpha 17 had been different, not because of defiance, not because of glory, but because he remembered. When Order 66 was given, the galaxy obeyed. Jedi fell without hesitation. Their defenders became their executioners. But Alpha didn't move. He had trained to follow orders, and he had, until that day. He remembered the way Shaak Ti moved through Kamino's reign. She walked like she belonged to the storm, not above it, quiet, centered, watching, always watching. He remembered her silence more than her words. That was what unnerved the others. Not her power, not her title, but her stillness, like she was listening for something beneath the war. Alpha 17 wasn't supposed to have questions, yet he found himself wondering why she always looked tired. Not physically, not in the way soldiers got. It was in her eyes, as if she'd seen too much of something the rest of them couldn't name. She never barked orders, never gave speeches. But when she entered a room, the noise stopped, because somehow everyone knew she wasn't pretending to care. She actually did. He remembered once, during training, a cadet collapsed from a lung wound caused by a faulty blaster round. While the medics rushed in, the instructors shouted to resume drills. But Shaak Ti had stepped in front of the line. She placed her hand on the cadet's chest. No words, just one breath. Then two. The boy lived, not because she healed him but because she stayed, even when there was nothing left to do. Alpha had watched her closely ever since. When the order came, he felt the shift in his bones, like the Force had been torn in two. The others responded immediately. It was in their blood, coded, trained, locked behind reflex. But something in him stilled. He had seen her kneel beside a dying cadet. He had seen her walk through battlefields, not with fire in her hands, but with sorrow in her steps. He couldn't raise his rifle. Not against her. The temple was already drowning in screams. Children ran, lights flickered, Blades hissed. Somewhere in that chaos, he had seen her only once. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't running. She was sitting, legs folded, hands resting on her knees, eyes closed. She looked relieved, as if the fight had never been hers to begin with. He left the temple without speaking to anyone, not because he feared punishment, but because he knew what they'd say, that he was malfunctioning, that he'd failed. But deep down he understood he hadn't disobeyed. He had remembered. Years passed. The Empire changed the face of the army. Clones were phased out, records erased, history rewritten. But Alpha 17 stayed hidden, living in the cracks of a galaxy that no longer had use for his kind. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't take sides. He just remembered. Not the battles, not the orders, but her. And that memory, unshaken, would one day become a question the Empire couldn't silence. Long before the Order, before the war had sharpened the lines between Jedi and soldier, Alpha 17 had kept a quiet habit. He listened, not to gossip or commands, but to the spaces between them, to the things left unsaid when the lights dimmed in the barracks and helmets came off. It was in those moments, tired, unguarded, that the truth of Shaak Ti began to echo through the ranks. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it wasn't instruction, it was understanding. While other Jedi barked tactics or parroted the code, she asked questions that made the clones pause. How are you sleeping? Have you named him yet? Do you remember the stars above Kamino? Small things, pointless by military logic. But it was in those questions that the soldiers found something strange, someone looking at them like people, not tools. Alpha remembered one night during a blackout drill. The generators had cut, plunging the barracks into shadow. No lights, no hollows, just silence and breath. A few voices began to hum an old march, dull and mechanical. Then softly from one of the corners, someone repeated a line Shaak Ti had said during a debriefing. The Force moves through all life, even those made to serve. They laughed at first, nervous, half-hearted. Then another clone repeated it, then another. And suddenly her words, calm, foreign Jedi, became part of their sleep routine, a superstition, a shield against the storm. They didn't believe in the Force, but they believed in the way she looked at them, like they mattered beyond their function. It wasn't public, never official. You wouldn't find it in any records, but Shaak Ti's name became a quiet code. Among the clones, she was the Jedi they could trust, the one who saw the cracks and didn't look away. Some said she used the Force to calm them. Others said she'd simply sit in silence and let them breathe. Alpha knew the truth was somewhere in between. She didn't try to fix them, she just let them be. As the war dragged on, the Republic changed. Morality became a luxury, and still she stayed the same, steady, tired, but grounded. While other Jedi grew colder, more detached, she grew quieter, as if grieving something no one else could see. During a particularly brutal campaign on Seleucami, a clone named X was severely injured by friendly fire. Command refused evac. He was marked as expendable, but Shaak Ti overruled it, personally escorting X through an active combat zone to reach a medevac site. She risked her life for one clone, not because he was special, but because no one else would. Stories like that spread like smoke, quiet, unseen, but everywhere. Alpha remembered walking past a group of new recruits one evening. They didn't salute. They were busy carving something into the durasteel beneath their bunks. Just 3 letters. C. C. When he asked them what it meant, one replied without looking up, "The one who sees us." Her voice wasn't in speeches or orders. It was in those small acts, staying late after training, defending a soldier no one remembered, asking how they were really doing. And even after she was gone, that voice didn't fade. It became part of them. After the war ended, most clones disappeared, not in death, but in relevance, replaced, forgotten. Their victories turned into political debts, their sacrifices rewritten. But Alpha 17 didn't vanish. He withdrew. No uniform, no command, no more brothers to report to. Just a name that meant nothing outside the barracks, and a memory that refused to leave him alone. He didn't speak of her for years. The galaxy had moved on, wrapped in stories of heroes and villains, of chosen ones and fallen orders. No one asked what it felt like to outlive them, to remember someone not for their lightsaber skills, but for a single moment of humanity in a war that had none. Alpha carried that moment like a wound. He remembered how Shaak Ti placed a hand on his shoulder before Kamino fell, not to bless him, not to instruct, just a stillness, as if she knew the end was near and wanted to say goodbye without saying anything. He never forgot the weight of that silence. It was heavier than any blaster he'd carried. When the Empire rose and Kamino was wiped clean of what it had created, Alpha wandered the outer rim, anonymous, unarmed, but he carried fragments of her in every step. He'd find himself stopping when he passed quiet rivers or the smell of sterile cloning facilities. Certain sounds triggered memories, the low hum of power cores, the sound of rain on metal. He hated those sounds, not because they reminded him of the war, but because they reminded him of her voice breaking through it. He wrote her name once, in the dirt outside an abandoned depot, just 3 letters again, Shaak Ti. He didn't know why he did it, maybe because no one else would. Years later, when a scholar from the early rebellion tracked him down, someone who wanted to document the Jedi Purge from a clone's perspective, Alpha refused at first. He wasn't interested in giving the Republic a cleaner story. But when the scholar mentioned Shaak Ti's name, something shifted. He didn't talk about her as a general. He didn't mention tactics or orders. He told the story of the night she sat with a dying clone who had no name, of how she held his hand while he slipped away, of how she stayed long after the body had gone cold. He described how she used to walk the barracks in silence, nodding to each clone as if she remembered their numbers, and maybe even their faces. The scholar asked if he thought she knew what was coming. Alpha said yes, but she didn't try to stop it. She prepared for it, in the only way she could, by making sure they knew they weren't just soldiers. That interview never aired. It was archived, buried under layers of red tape and forgotten rebellion files. But it existed, somewhere in the digital dust. His voice still carried her name. He never looked for recognition. He didn't want medals or apologies. He just wanted her remembered the way he saw her. Not a warrior, not a council member, not a casualty, just a person who chose kindness when everything around her screamed for war. That was what he carried, through silence, through exile, through a galaxy that never stopped burning. And that was enough. The years stretched far beyond the war. Jedi became myth, the clones became numbers, and Alpha 17 became a whisper in records nobody read. But something strange happened in the years after Endor, as the galaxy tried to rebuild a future it barely understood. A junior archivist found the recording. It was misfiled, a broken datapad buried under requisition logs from rebel outposts. No metadata, no classification, just an old voice, speaking plainly, slowly, like he didn't expect anyone to listen. That voice said her name. Not with ceremony, not with reverence, just with weight. Shaak Ti. She sat with the dying. That sib's what I remember. The archivist was too young to remember Kamino, too distant to grasp the full scale of the Clone Wars. But something in that voice, in the quiet pauses, in the aching restraint, made her listen again. Then she transcribed it. She didn't ask permission, she didn't request clearance, she just copied it and sent it to every historian who still cared about the Jedi Purge. It spread slowly, not viral, not dramatic, but it reached people who needed to hear it. Former clones in hiding, new Jedi learning what was lost, senators who never picked a side during the war, but always wondered what the Jedi really were. not the temple, not the robes, but the people underneath. Alpha 17's voice became a reminder that not every clone had obeyed blindly, that not every Jedi fell without witness, that someone saw her, not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments before everything collapsed. The testimony didn't rewrite history, it didn't spark a movement, but in libraries, databanks and forgotten corners of the holonet, Shaak Ti's name started to show up again. Not as a footnote, not as a casualty, but as a presence. Some called her the still light. Others simply said she was the one Jedi who met her end with eyes open and no anger in her heart. The Force didn't roar when she died. There were no tremors, no visions, just a silence that stretched through time. A silence that waited for someone, anyone, to speak of it. And Alpha did. Not with pride, not with guilt, but with memory. In his final years, before his health gave out, he returned to Kamino, what was left of it. Just ocean now. No towers, no labs, no white-armored futures. He stood at the edge of a platform that barely held together, and he spoke out loud, not to ghosts, not to the Force, just to the wind. I remembered you. That was the last known recording of Alpha 17. He died alone, unrecognized, unburied, but not forgotten. Because when the new Jedi Order started rebuilding its archives, someone added a small file, not a holovid, not an official report, just audio, his voice. And beneath it, a single note. She stayed with us. That note was written by someone who never knew her, never fought beside her, never heard her voice in life. But they felt the echo, through testimony, through a clone who remembered, through a galaxy still aching from everything it chose to forget. Shaak Ti didn't shape the galaxy through power, she didn't defy the purge, she didn't survive. But she was carried forward, in memory, in regret, in the quiet bravery of someone who chose not to forget. And in a galaxy that often confuses survival with strength, her true legacy became something rarer. She was remembered not for what she fought against, but for what she chose to protect, even when no one else could see it anymore. She never came back down the path. Not the one through the jungle, not the one that led to her family's dwelling, carved into the roots of an old growth tree. Not the narrow trail where the soil stayed warm long after sundown, holding the weight of the last steps she ever took on Shili. Shaak Ti's return never happened, and her people knew. The Togruta are not loud mourners. Their grief does not come in wails or great gestures. It comes in the silence of woven beads left untouched on doorways, in half-finished meals no one dares clear from the table. It comes in the form of a question no one asks out loud. Will she ever come home? No one had an answer, but they knew, somewhere deep in their instincts, the way prey animals sense a storm long before it arrives, they understood, she was gone. And the Force echoed it. There was no funeral pyre, no galactic broadcast honoring her sacrifice. Her name was not sung in the capital or carved in stone on Coruscant, but on Shili. The vines were braided in her color, red and white, 1,000 strands, hanging between trees, fluttered softly in the wind. Elders gathered at the edge of the jungle, the same elders who once watched her climb trees higher than she was allowed, who scolded her for wandering too far near the cliffs, who heard her laugh before they ever saw her. They stood in silence now, faces painted, voices quiet, each holding a small bowl of crushed shell dust, red ochre mixed with dried flowers. They didn't speak her Jedi name, that belonged to the galaxy, not here. Here, she was just Tyr, the child who used to chase light bugs after dusk, the girl who left her sandals behind because she said the dirt felt better, the one who never stopped asking why the trees bent the way they did, and who disappeared one day into the hands of the Republic. They had known she was different, not just gifted, but distant, even before the Jedi came. She always heard something the others didn't, felt things they couldn't explain. And when the Jedi Scout came, they didn't try to stop her. They only asked her to come back one day. She never did. But her memory did. Even before the Clone Wars, the Togruta of Shili whispered stories about her, that she had become powerful, that her presence could calm beasts and silence crowds, that in the Jedi Temple she had grown silent, thoughtful, yet not cold, that she had not forgotten them. Some said she sent messages, small ones, never recorded, never formal, but sent through travelers, through merchants, through pilots who passed by Shili and were given a name to carry. Tell them T remembers the red cliffs, or tell them the jungle still lives in my sleep. These quiet messages became relics, memorized, repeated, written nowhere but known by everyone. And then they stopped coming. The war swallowed everything, and after the war came only darkness. The Empire did not acknowledge Shaak Ti's fate. The Jedi Temple was silent. The people of Shili were told nothing. No death announcement, no holovid proof, just stillness. But stillness speaks. On the third cycle after the war ended, the villagers gathered again, not because they had proof she was gone, but because they could feel it in the way the wind changed, in how the jungle no longer seemed to wait for her. They walked to the highest cliff, where the branches opened to the sky, and they lit no fire. They said no names. They only scattered her beads into the air. The red and white threads danced for a moment, then fell slowly, carried by the quiet air, into the trees. That was their way. Not to beg for her return, but to let her know they remembered, even if the galaxy forgot her, even if the Republic erased her, even if the Empire buried her. On Shili, the dirt still held her shape, the jungle still paused in the afternoons, waiting to hear her footfall. The wind still moved like it did when she left. She never came back down the path. But it was never closed. The trees knew first. Before the elders, before the mothers, before the night watchers who read the stars. It wasn't sudden, no storm, no fire, just an absence, a space where something once flowed. Shaak Ti's presence had lingered for years after she left, like dew that stays long after sunrise, but then one day, it didn't. No one said it aloud. They didn't set need to. Among the Togruta, silence is not emptiness, it's language, and the jungle speaks it fluently. In the weeks after her presence faded, the forest changed its rhythm. The shriek birds moved their nesting grounds. The river changed its scent. The morning mists no longer came as thick. Small things, unspoken shifts, but enough. Some said it was the will of the Force. Others whispered it was morning. There was a place, deep in the heart of the jungle, where T used to sit as a child. A circle of flat stones beside a slow-moving stream. Her father had taken her there to teach her how to listen, not with her ears, but with her skin, to feel the shift in the wind, to sense when something sacred was nearby. She had loved that place, returned to it every chance she got, even after the Jedi took her. Decades later, that circle remained untouched. No vines grew across it, no animals nested in its shade. The forest left it alone, like a sacred scar. During the Empire's rise, a few villagers began leaving offerings there, small ones, not candles or idols, just her favorite fruit, a smooth stone, a carved figure of a tree, things she might recognize if she ever returned. No one claimed the idea. No one took credit. It simply became part of the routine. Every moon cycle, a child was chosen to carry the new offering. They were told nothing about Shaak Ti, only to walk in silence, only to listen, only to leave the gift and come back. Most of them never asked why. They just obeyed, as if some part of them already knew. And one day, the offering was never retrieved. Not by wind, not by animals, not by time. It just stayed there, rotting, decaying, waiting. That was when they stopped, when the elders finally understood. She was not coming back. Not in body, Not in message, not in any way they could touch. But she had returned in another way, through the Force. Some of the oldest villagers claimed they felt her near the cliff's edge at night, that she whispered through the trees during the hottest days, that their dreams were filled with images of her walking barefoot across the jungle floor, smiling, not as a warrior, but as a child. They weren't set hallucinations, not to them. They were messages. The Force, they believed, was carrying her memory through the roots and branches of Shili's oldest trees, that her spirit, like the spirits of their own ancestors, had become part of the jungle. The young didn't understand, not fully, but they watched. They saw how even the roughest hunters lowered their heads near the stone circle, how even the proudest Togruta warriors paused when wind rustled the high canopy. It was respect, it was grief, it was belief. Not in her powers, but in her presence, because the trees had known first, and the people had learned to trust the trees. So they stopped asking when she said return. They started listening instead. For the wind that moved without breeze, for the sound of leaves shifting when no foot touched the ground, for the echo of someone long gone who still hadn't fully left. There was no funeral, there couldn't be, no body, no remains, no message from the Jedi Temple, nothing official, only silence, the kind that confirms what words can't. But the people of Shili didn't need a death certificate to mourn. They held rites anyway. Not for Shaak Ti, the Jedi Master, not for the general who led armies or the warrior who stood on distant worlds. That version of her belonged to another galaxy, to politics, to war, to things Shili had no interest in remembering. Their rites were for the girl who used to braid river grass into her montrolls, for the child who laughed too loud during thunder, for the daughter who once promised she'd return before the sun touched the sea, and almost always did. The ceremony began at dusk. They gathered in the same place she had last stood before leaving, the cliff edge overlooking the southern basin. Generations had come to that spot to say goodbye, to watch ships leave, to watch loved ones vanish into the sky. No drums were played, no names were spoken. The Togruta did not call the dead by voice, they honored them with presence. Each person brought a stone, smooth, dark, flat, carried in silence, placed at the cliff's edge, one by one, no order, no structure, just the rhythm of grief. When the last stone was laid, they built a shape, a spiral, not a tomb, not a monument, a path that circled inward, ending at a single flame. A single child, a distant cousin of hers, lit the flame. Not with fire, but with breath. A tradition older than the Republic. She exhaled across a bed of moss until it caught the light from the setting sun. The flame flickered once, then held. It wasn't death meant to burn long. It was meant to carry a message. Some say the wind shifted when it rose, that the flame leaned toward the jungle, not the sky, that the birds didn't sing that night. Whatever truth there was in those stories, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the people remembered her their way, without blaster salutes, without medals, without lists of her victories, only a circle of stones, only a single breath, only a silent vow that she would not be erased. In the days after the rite, something changed in the village. Children started asking who she was. Not the Jedi, but the girl. They asked about her favorite fruit, about her mischief, about the way she used to steal honey roots and hide them under her bed. Stories began to circulate again, old ones that had grown quiet, how she once got lost in the jungle for 2 days and came back with no fear in her eyes, how she calmed a wounded grazer with nothing but a song, how she sat in the trees during storms, pretending to command the lightning. These weren't set myths. They were fragments of her truth, passed down like seeds, buried deep in those who stayed behind. No one taught them in schools, no one carved her into statues, But somehow every child knew her name by the time they turned 5. Not because she was famous, but because she was remembered. And that tests how her people grieved. Not with loud tears or grand processions, but with repetition, with memory, with simple shared breath. A flame that flickered once and never fully went out. The canopy above Shili never stopped moving. Even in still air, the leaves rustled like whispers passing from one tree to the next. The elders used to say it was how the ancestors spoke, not with voices but with motion. And sometimes, when the wind passed just right, it felt like she was part of it. Shaak Ti didn't return in body, but something of her lingered. It wasn't Force ghosts or Jedi visions. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be seen or explained. It was a knowing, a weight in the trees, a presence that didn't press, only hovered, softly. Some villagers claimed they felt her near the rivers, where she used to sit for hours watching the current pull at the moss. Others said the birds flew differently through the eastern groves, banking wider, as if avoiding an invisible path. One hunter swore he saw her footprints once, just 2 impressions in the mud facing the horizon. None of them spoke these things loudly. They weren't meant to be stories, just quiet facts passed from heart to heart. Years passed, the spiral of stones weathered and crumbled, moss grew between them, the flame pit filled with rain and time, but people still walked the path, not to mourn, but to listen. To stand at the edge of the basin and wait. For what? They didn't know. Maybe for her, maybe for themselves. Maybe just to remember what it meant to send someone away and never truly get them back. One elder began teaching the children a quiet lesson, not in a classroom, not in words, but through walks. She would take them down the same trail Shaak Ti once followed as a child, show them the route she used to trip over, the branch she used as a walking stick, the rock she painted with red clay, half washed away now but still faint. At the end of the trail she would sit with them under the canopy and let them ask anything. Did she really talk to trees? Why did she leave? Did she ever come back to say goodbye? The elder never answered directly. She would point to the rustling leaves above and say only, "Ask them." And somehow the children felt that was enough. Some grew up to forget, others moved away, but a few, just enough, stayed. They kept the path clear. They placed new stones when the old ones cracked. They lit small flames each year on the day she left. And when travelers came asking about Jedi, they didn't speak of the Clone Wars, or lightsabers, or the ranks she held. They told them about the barefoot girl who once promised she'd be back before sunset. The one who didn't quite make it. The one who still might. There was no closure. No final chapter. Only the canopy whispering things no one could quite hear, but everyone understood. And in that soft, persistent wind, she remained. Not as a figure in a temple. Not as a martyr. But as a memory that refused to fade. She had been many things, warrior, teacher, protector. But to Shili she was never any of those first. She was their child. And even after the galaxy forgot, the trees remembered. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that asks to be heard, the kind that expects to be ignored. Shaak Ti understood things long before anyone admitted them. Not through prophecy, not through calculation, but by standing still when everyone else was rushing past. She watched the same meetings, heard the same briefings, read the same casualty reports. But what she saw was different. She was not there for the headlines. Not when Yoda led the charge on Kashyyyk, not when Mace Windu stood before the Chancellor, not when Anakin walked into the temple, but she had already seen what would happen, in fragments, not visions, just patterns repeating in silence. The Jedi were changing, so was the Senate, and the war was moving in a direction she could not name, but felt deep in her chest every time she closed her eyes. On Kamino she stayed. She walked the sterile halls not as a general but as a witness. She didn't just inspect the clones, she looked at them, watched how they stood in line, how they blinked, how they waited for orders without blinking at all. They were never meant to choose. That was what made them reliable, and that was what made them dangerous. She didn't say this out loud, not because she feared backlash, but because she feared she was too late. She meditated in isolation, not out of discipline, but to make sense of it all. The Force had grown harder to read, like a storm cloud moving overhead, muting the stars. She tried to reach into it, to understand what was shifting, but all she felt was that something sacred was leaving, not violently, quietly, like the sound of a planet cooling after centuries of heat. When she spoke with other masters, her warnings were often received with polite silence. They saw her as wise, yes, but distant, too meditative, too soft-spoken. They didn't hear the worry in her voice. Maybe because they didn't want to, or maybe because they were too close to the fight. She had once been close too, but something had changed when she watched the first batch of clones march without hesitation into war. She had felt pride at first, then guilt, then something colder, a question that never left her. What if this war was never ours? She saw Anakin change too, from a distance. His presence grew heavier, not darker in the obvious ways, just harder to read, like a wall being built, layer by layer, between him and the rest of the Order. She mentioned it once, asked if others had noticed. The answer came in shrugs, in dismissals, in that familiar Jedi way of not saying what they feared might be true. And so she watched. She watched democracy bend itself backward to justify necessity. She watched the Jedi lose parts of themselves they never realized were missing. She watched the war shift from defense to pursuit, from peacekeeping to occupation. She watched senators speak about unity while building private armies. She watched the younglings in the temple train harder, faster, with more drills and fewer teachings, and still she said little. Not because she lacked the words, but because she had said them before, and they hadn't made a difference. Her silence was not surrender. It was the only way left to listen. While the others talked of tactics, Shaak Ti listened to the walls, the way the temple echoed differently at night, the way the clones' boots sounded more like stormtroopers with each passing week, the way the Force itself seemed to retreat from the places it once lingered. She didn't run. Even when she had the chance, even when the whispers grew louder, she stayed, because leaving would have meant closing her eyes, and Shaak Ti had promised herself, if nothing else, that she would keep them open until the very end. The fall didn't come like fire, it came like dust, quiet, slow, settling in places no one bothered to clean. The Jedi Temple still stood, the Council still met, the clones still saluted. But something had already collapsed inside. Shaak Ti felt it long before the others admitted it. A fracture, not loud, but spreading. She sat through meetings where Jedi Masters discussed enemy movements like they were chess pieces, and she wondered how many of those enemies had once been allies, entire planets reclassified with a word, loyal yesterday, separatist today, a shift in title, not in truth. But once the label stuck, their lives became fair game. She heard it in the way the commanders spoke. Targets, objectives, collateral. Kamino became her station, but it never felt like a posting. It felt like a sentence. She was not banished there, not officially, but it was easier to let her stay with the clones than to hear her concerns echoed through the council chambers again. She knew too much, saw too much. And yet she could not change what was coming. She began watching the instructors more closely, the way they treated the cadets. There was discipline, yes, but there was also fear that the clones might begin to think beyond their training. One instructor was quietly removed after a clone questioned an order, not rebelled, just asked a question. The clone was reassigned to frontline duty. No one spoke of him again. Shaak Ti asked for his name. She received only a number. She found the meditation chambers on Kamino empty, not because no one used them, because they were never built. Clones were not expected to reflect, only to follow. Shaak Ti began meditating in storage rooms, maintenance corridors, anywhere she could feel the force without it being filtered through synthetic light and sterile routines. Even then the force seemed thinner, not absent, just distant, like it was bracing itself for what was coming. She heard rumors of something buried beneath the programming, a protocol no one was supposed to access. Inhibitor chips, they said, behavioral safeguards. She brought it up with the Kaminoans. They smiled, their expressions never changed, neither did their answers. It is a security measure. It is nothing to worry about. It will only activate if necessary. She asked who would decide what was necessary. They didn't respond. She contacted the council, sent her reports, explained what she had found. A few nodded. Some agreed to look into it. Others reminded her of the war's urgency. There was no time for suspicion, no time for fear, only trust, always trust. Shaak Ti said nothing, but inside, she felt it settle like dust again. Trust had become the excuse for blindness. And yet she stayed. The clones saluted her with precision. They followed her commands, but she saw the conditioning behind their eyes. She tried to speak to them as individuals, learned their names, not numbers. Some responded, some smiled, some asked questions of their own. But the closer she got to them, the more it hurt when they were reassigned, sent to missions with no return, their files marked as closed, their stories never told. She wrote a personal record of every clone she met, a quiet act of rebellion, not a database. Just words, names, moments. One laughed when it rained for the first time. One carved small figures from spare parts. One asked what Jedi dreams were like. Shaak Ti didn't know why she kept the list. Maybe because she knew one day, no one else would. She wasn't surprised when the visions returned. She hadn't seen them in years, not clearly. But now they came in flashes, helmets turning, lightsabers falling, smoke rising in the temple halls. She told herself they were just fears, echoes of what might be, not what would be. But the Force was not warning her anymore. It was grieving. And still, the Republic spoke of victory, of progress, of peace through control. Kamino flooded with new requests for clones, faster growth, cheaper units, better compliance. Shaak Ti stood in the middle of it all, and felt the walls grow colder. The future was being built with the bones of the present. She could have left, filed for reassignment, asked to return to Coruscant, but she didn't, because she believed someone had to remain. Someone had to remember that these soldiers were not tools, that they had faces, that they once asked what dreams felt like. She stayed, not to stop what was coming, but to witness it, so that when it happened, someone could say it didn't arrive unnoticed. It was always quiet at night on Kamino. Not peaceful, just quiet. The waves outside never stopped, but inside the cloning facility, everything was still. Even the clone troopers, even the cadets, seemed to breathe in rhythm with the machines. Shaak Ti used to walk the upper corridors alone during these hours. She didn't meditate. She didn't sleep. She listened to silence, to footsteps, to voices behind sealed doors. The Kaminoans thought she didn't hear them, but she did. They spoke of adjustments, of protocols, of projects handed down from the Chancellor's office, marked essential. She wasn't granted access. She was a Jedi Master, but she wasn't in control. Not here. She asked questions. They told her the war demanded certain measures. She reminded them that the Jedi were supposed to oversee the war effort. They responded with smiles that said nothing. She began keeping her own records, copies of access logs, behavior patterns, deviation reports. She noticed shifts in clone behavior after certain medical sessions, emotional flattening, short-term memory interruptions, increased aggression thresholds. The signs were small, but they were there. When she confronted the chief medical technician, the answer was clinical: stability must be maintained. She asked what stability meant. No answer came. She wasn't said paranoid. She was alone. Even among the Jedi, few wanted to hear it. The war consumed everything. If the clones performed well, if battles were won, the methods didn't matter. Some masters nodded politely at her concerns. Others avoided her altogether. She began sending encrypted messages, not to accuse, just to warn, to say something is wrong, something is being hidden beneath our feet. She didn't expect an answer, but one came from an unexpected voice. Fives. A clone trooper who'd seen something too large to forget. He reached out to her after the death of his brother Top. Top had malfunctioned during battle, killed a Jedi, and no one could explain why. Fives had dug deeper, found a chip in Top's brain, claimed it was in all of them, claimed it was part of something called Order 66. Shaak Ti listened, not with skepticism, with sorrow, because the pieces finally fit. She'd felt it, all this time. And now a soldier had said it aloud. She tried to protect him. She offered to bring him back to Kamino, to investigate quietly, but others intervened. Medical officers, officials from Coruscant. They claimed he was unstable, that his trauma made him dangerous. He was brought in for evaluation. He disappeared soon after. The report said he attacked personnel, that he resisted help, that he died in custody. Shaak Ti read the report 5 times. It didn't feel true. It felt written, smoothed out, cleansed of anything real. The chip, the order, the truth, all buried in words, all sealed under the doctrine of security. She sat alone in her quarters that night, lights dimmed, rain tapping on the glass. She placed her hand against the window. The force felt still, like it was holding its breath. She had seen the truth, and now the truth was gone. She thought about leaving, about bringing what she knew to the Senate, to the Council, to the public. But she remembered the faces of those who dismissed her, the glazed eyes of those who didn't want to hear. The orders carried out before questions were even asked. The war had made the galaxy stop listening. So she stayed. She tightened her security clearances. She began writing again, not just lists of names, but personal accounts, of Fives, of Top, of every anomaly, every silence, every moment that didn't add up. She stored them in encrypted archives, hidden beneath innocuous system logs. It wasn't rebellion, it was memory. Because she knew the day would come when the truth would be erased, when the Jedi Temple would fall, when the clone barracks would empty, when everything she served would become a forgotten page in a history written by those who had silenced Fives. And when that happened, she wanted there to be something left behind, a record, a witness, a voice that said, someone saw this, someone tried to understand, someone remembered. The secrets were never meant to last. But neither was silence. Shaak Ti stood at the edge of the chamber as the clones passed in formation. She didn't watch their armor, their discipline or their weapons. She watched their eyes. It had become a quiet ritual. This act of seeing them not as numbers or soldiers, but as children whose lives had been stolen by purpose. She had trained many of them, spoken to even more, and still they never truly knew who she was. That was her choice. She could have been more present. She could have led from the front lines like Windu or Kenobi, but she had chosen the back corridors, the silent paths, the dark rooms where no one watched, because someone had to, because war wasn't fought only in battles, it was shaped in decisions, small ones, ones the galaxy never noticed until it was too late. And she had noticed all of them. She saw how the Jedi stopped questioning, how they accepted special operations, special exceptions, special silence, how Anakin changed, how his anger was ignored, how Palpatine gathered more power, and how every protest turned into polite silence. The signs were everywhere. The Council felt them, but they kept moving. kept hoping it would hold just a little longer. Shaak Ti didn't hope. She saw, even as the war came closer to its end, and rumors spread of a superweapon, of lost Jedi, of power shifting faster than anyone could follow, she stayed on Kamino, watching, recording. She wasn't waiting for redemption. She wasn't planning to stop anything. She knew what was coming. The darkness wasn't rising. It was already here. She had once believed her life would mean something in battle, that she'd be remembered as a warrior. But now, in the silence of her watching, she found something more honest. Legacy wasn't what you shouted. It was what you chose to carry, even when no one saw it, even when it changed nothing. When the signal came, when the clones turned, when the Jedi began falling, she didn't scream. She walked to the final archive console, entered the last access code. She uploaded everything: encrypted logs, test results, behavioral patterns, interviews, recordings. She didn't label it proof, just what she saw. The Kaminoans found her later, standing still, unmoving. They said she refused to evacuate. They said she claimed the station still needed a Jedi presence. Maybe that was true, or maybe she was already mourning what she knew had happened across the galaxy. She received no warning, no visit, just a flicker in the Force. And then the silence ended. Blaster fire rang through the corridor. The clones who had once guarded her door walked in. They didn't hesitate. Neither did she. The reports say she fought well, that she defended the chamber until the end, that her lightsaber carved through the room like a memory of war. But no record shows what she was thinking. No hololog reveals the final expression on her face. That was for her alone. She didn't die asking why. She had already asked. She didn't fight to win. She fought because she had seen them as people. Because even if the war erased her name, she wanted her last act to be a refusal to let silence win. When the transmission finally leaked years later, when survivors found fragments of her logs, it wasn't a revelation, it was confirmation that someone had seen it, that someone knew. Not a hero, not a savior. Just someone who watched too long, and still chose not to look away.